Joel Mercer drove the same 12 miles of logging road every morning before the sun cleared the ridge. The truck was 11 years old, its shocks long past their useful life, and every frost heave sent a jolt through his lower back that reminded him how a fall 4 years ago hadn't broken anything cleanly, just rearranged things badly enough to make itself known on cold mornings and on the kind of terrain where good judgment would recommend stopping. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He mostly ignored it. He had been ignoring it for 4 years, and it was still there, so the two of them had reached a kind of understanding. He ate breakfast at the wheel, a thermos of black coffee and a granola bar, the same combination every morning for 3 years running. He had stopped cooking real meals sometime in the middle of his first winter in the sector, not dramatically, just the way small accommodations accumulated until they became permanent. There was no one to cook for. There was no occasion that made trying seem worth the effort. The granola bar and the thermos were sufficient. They got the work done. The logging road passed through second-growth fir for most of its length, the trees dense on both sides and dark in the early mornings, their branches holding the night cold longer than the open sky above. There were sections where deer crossed regularly, and sections where the road dipped close to a small tributary and the sound of running water filled the cab briefly before the road climbed away from it. He knew every turn, every soft shoulder, every place the drainage failed in heavy rain and the gravel washed to one side. He had driven this road hundreds of times, and it had the particular quality of a route learned by repetition past the point of conscious attention, something the body navigated while the mind worked elsewhere. The Coldwater Creek sector covered 42 square miles of remote high country in the Cascade foothills of Washington state. The kind of terrain that showed up on maps as blank contour lines, unnamed tributaries, and ridge markings that no hiking guide had bothered to describe in detail because almost nobody went there. The sector had one maintained trailhead, 3 seasonal access routes that deteriorated to mud by November, and a visitor count Joel could summarize in a paragraph. Hikers who wandered in were usually lost. The ones who came intentionally were after solitude or hunting season, often both, and none of them stayed past dark. The younger rangers in his district had the developed parks, day-use trails with signage and pit toilets, and a visitor center that ran weekend programming. They logged significant public contact hours, which had become a real metric in the annual performance review 3 cycles ago. Joel's public contact hours were negligible by that measurement. He had tried, once, to explain to District Director Hal Briggs that the remote sector demanded a different kind of presence, more sustained, less countable, but Hal had nodded in the careful way of a man whose mind was already settled. The nod was not agreement. It was management. Joel was 51. He had been a ranger since he was 28, and for the better part of those 23 years the work had felt worthwhile in a way he could not have articulated to anyone who asked him directly. Not exciting, rarely dramatic. Mostly the sustained practice of knowing a piece of land well enough to detect when something had shifted before it became a problem. Trail erosion after a hard rain. Unauthorized fire rings. Animal behavior that suggested a predator spending too much time near the access road. The small changes in a system that accumulated into something significant if you were paying attention and knew what you were looking for. He had been good at it. He had been good at it for a long time. His marriage had not survived the combination of qualities the work required. Darlene had been direct about it during the last real conversation they'd had, standing in the kitchen of their rented house outside Yakima while their son Marcus slept down the hall. She had not called Joel a bad father or a cruel husband, because he was neither. She said she sometimes felt she was living with a person who was always somewhere slightly else. Present in the room and absent in some way she couldn't name precisely, because it wasn't absence exactly. More like distance. The kind that doesn't announce itself. She had been right. Joel had understood that even as she said it, and the understanding hadn't changed anything, which was probably its own answer. Their daughter Cassie was 24 now. She lived in Bend, Oregon, with a man named Tyler who sold outdoor equipment and had strong opinions about coffee that Joel found mildly exhausting the 2 times he'd been in his company. Their son Marcus was 27, worked construction in Tacoma, and communicated with his father in the efficient, affectionate shorthand of a young man who was not cold but was also very busy. Joel called on birthdays. He sent cards at Christmas signed Love, Dad, and then his name in full, as if the word alone weren't enough identification. Sometimes Cassie called him when things were hard, and those calls were the ones he replayed, not because he had said the right things, but because they confirmed the connection still held somewhere beneath the distance. His mother had died 2 years ago. Congestive heart failure, managed for 3 years before the management stopped working. She had lived in eastern Washington her whole life, in a house that smelled like coffee and old magazines, and she had called him every Sunday without fail. The Sundays since her death had a quality of emptiness he had not found a way to address. He didn't try. He understood that some things didn't improve with effort, only with time, and time was doing what it did at its own pace regardless of what he required of it. The medical costs from her final year had cleared most of what he'd managed to save in the previous decade. He had helped carry what her insurance hadn't covered, because she had no one else to help, and because he was her son, and that was not a calculation he had ever made consciously. It was simply what the situation required. But it left him thin. The ranger's salary had never been generous, and at 51, with a bad back and a knee that had begun to complain on stairs, the margin between the salary and the cost of living was narrower than it had ever been. 2 months ago, Hal Briggs had called him into his office and used careful language about budget reviews, restructuring priorities, and the operational efficiency of folding the remote high country into a broader patrol zone managed from the main visitor center. The language was careful because the conclusion it pointed to was not. Joel's role would change significantly. That was the phrase used. Change significantly. It was what you said to a person when you weren't yet prepared to say the simpler thing, which was that the job as they had known it for 23 years was ending. Joel had driven back up the mountain after that meeting and walked 2 miles into the backcountry on a trail no one, but he had used all season, and he had stood at the edge of a meadow listening to water running somewhere in the ravine below, and he had felt the particular ache of a man who has built his life around a place that does not require him to remain in it. He drove the logging road every morning and turned this over. He drove it before the sun cleared the ridge, in the gray of early light, coffee in the cup holder, the truck moving over frost-heaved gravel at a pace calibrated to the road's condition, and he examined his situation from different angles the way he examined terrain. He was 51, 23 years in service, modest savings, diminished by 2 years of his mother's medical bills, a bad back, a knee, a job being reorganized around him, no partner, no property, 2 adult children who needed him in the abstract sense more than the immediate one. The practical arithmetic of his life pointed clearly toward one conclusion. He drove the logging road and thought about it and arrived at the trailhead and put his pack on and walked into the trees, and every time the forest closed around him and the sound of the road disappeared, he felt what the arithmetic couldn't account for. The thing that didn't fit in any calculation. The specific rightness of being in a place where the work was real and the ground was honest, and the only sound for miles was water moving through stone. He had been at Coldwater Creek for 3 years. The sector had been logged once, in the early part of the 20th century, and the second growth that had come up since was now 60 years old and had begun to take on the character of old-growth timber without quite arriving there yet. The canopy was dense enough to block most direct light through much of the year, and the forest floor was perpetually damp, layered with sword fern and oxalis, broken by nurse logs running 20 or 30 feet through the understory as they slowly returned to soil. The whole sector smelled of cold water and decomposing fir and the particular mineral smell that came from wet basalt after rain. Water moved through the sector in a complex network of small tributaries and seasonal channels, some too minor to appear on any map, others significant enough to have carved respectable ravines over a few thousand years of patient work. Joel knew all of them. He knew which ones held trout and which ran too cold and shallow, which ones flooded hard after a heavy rain and which drained quickly through gravel beds. He knew the sound each one made, the specific pitch and tempo of each stream's voice, the way each changed between seasons. He could navigate by them in poor visibility the way he used landmarks in open country. Coldwater Creek was the main channel, flowing from a source in the upper subalpine and running approximately 8 miles before meeting a larger river to the west. The creek was clear year-round, cold even in August, running over smooth basalt and fine gravel that shifted position after every significant flood event. It held a small population of native cutthroat trout that Joel had been informally monitoring since his first spring in the sector, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the trout told him things about water quality and temperature that no instrument available to him could measure as continuously or as cheaply. The waterfall was 6 miles from the trailhead. The trail section leading to it had been closed for 11 years following rockfall events that had blocked the lower approach, and Joel maintained the closure markers each season as a matter of routine. Nobody pushed past them. The falls were not on any trail guide, not mentioned in any recreational resource for the area, and the combination of the closure and the distance from any developed access meant that in 3 years of patrols, Joel had not encountered a single other person anywhere near them. He had found the waterfall in his second autumn in the sector, following the creek upstream on a slow October afternoon out of the kind of curiosity that long familiarity with a place will occasionally generate. He had heard it before he saw it, a low sustained sound, layered and resonant, unlike the smaller drops he had passed on the way up, and when he came around the final bend in the creek bed, the sight of it stopped him where he stood. The falls dropped 60 feet from a ledge of exposed basalt into a pool that was, in summer, a still and startling shade of green. The rock face on either side was dark with permanent moisture, colonized by moss and thick vertical bands that had been growing there for decades. The mist the falls generated drifted out across the pool's surface in slow, spinning patterns before dissolving in the air. There was something about the scale of the place that adjusted a person's sense of proportion. The cliff above, the old-growth firs leaning inward from both sides of the ravine, the sound filling every direction simultaneously in a way that made thinking in words briefly unnecessary. Joel had stood there for 20 minutes the first time without taking a photograph, partly because he hadn't brought his camera, and partly because he already understood that photographs wouldn't do anything useful with a place like this. He had come back every season since, not on any official schedule, just when the condition of the trail and the condition of his thinking warranted it. The rock on the east side of the pool was broad and flat enough to sit on for 20 minutes without getting soaked, and when he sat there the sound of the falls produced a white noise so complete that his mind stopped running its ordinary background processes and simply held still. He had come to value that more than he would have admitted to anyone, particularly since the meeting with Hal Briggs. There was a version of his life in which this place appeared nowhere, in which he had taken a different posting years ago, worked a sector with visitor contact and public programming and the kind of metrics that made sense in a spreadsheet, and had never followed the creek upstream on a slow October afternoon out of curiosity. That version of his life was not worse in any way he could have measured from the outside. He would have had the same salary, the same difficult back, the same adult children in Bend and Tacoma. But it would have been missing this. The specific gravity of a place known so well and valued so quietly that it amounted, after 3 years, to something he could not have named cleanly, but which was real. In 6 years of visits, he had looked at the cliff face behind the falls dozens of times. He had looked at it the way he looked at everything in the sector, carefully, without expectation, in the manner of a person who has accounted for most of what is present and is not anticipating revision. He was a good observer. He had been a good observer for a long time. He had been wrong about what he'd accounted for. He understood that now. The afternoon he first saw the marks was a Tuesday in late September. He had been delayed reaching the falls by a storm-toppled cedar across the main trail, green wood and heavy with moisture, requiring an hour's work with a handsaw before it was clear enough to pass. His back registered its consistent objection to the work, the familiar complaint he had been acknowledging and setting aside for 4 years. By the time he reached the pool, it was around 2 in the afternoon, 2 hours later than his ordinary arrival time. The light in late September was different from summer. The sun tracked lower, its arc shallower, and in the hour before it dropped behind the western ridge it hit the cliff face at a nearly horizontal angle. That angle did something specific to surfaces. It pulled shadows out of shallow cuts and grooves that overhead or direct light flattened into invisibility, made visible the fine topography of rock that the rest of the year stayed hidden. Joel was crouched at the pool's edge filling his water bottle when he raised his eyes to the cliff face and saw something he had not seen in 6 years of standing in this exact spot. A line of cuts in the rock, 8 feet to the left of the main curtain of water. Vertical, regular, deliberate. He stood. He capped his water bottle. He walked around the pool's edge to the base of the cliff, picking his way over wet rocks with the automatic care the surface demanded. He crouched at the base of the line and touched the lowest cut with one finger. The edge was smooth, worn down by years of exposure to the mist. Not fractured, not random. A chisel had made these cuts. A steel chisel, driven with a hammer at consistent angles and with consistent force by someone who knew what they were doing. The cuts were spaced approximately 6 inches apart and ran upward from chest height to a point perhaps 14 feet above the pool's edge, where the cliff face angled slightly inward toward the falls. At the top of the line, the rock was partially obscured by the leftmost thread of falling water, the angle preventing any clear view of what lay above or behind it. He stood and looked at the pattern. He counted 19 cuts, regular spacing, appropriate depth for a handhold. Someone had cut a climbing route into this cliff face. He pulled out his field notebook and drew what he saw. His handwriting was cramped and habitual, 23 years of field notes compressed into a personal shorthand. He noted the spacing, the depth, the surface condition of the cuts. The weathering and mineral deposition along the edges told him these were old. Very old. Decades of exposure to the fall's mist, which carried dissolved minerals and deposited them on every surface it reached, had rounded the cut edges and partially filled the deepest points of each hold with a pale mineral crust. He noted the rock type. He noted the tool direction. He noted the estimated age. Then he stood at the base of the cliff and looked up, and looked at the falls, and looked at the way the curtain of water partially concealed the cliff face above. The top of the handhold line. He drove home that evening thinking about it in the specific way he thought about things that didn't fit his existing understanding of a place. Not anxious thinking. Methodical. The way you work through an unfamiliar noise in a system you know well, running down possibilities until you find the one that explains what you heard. He stopped at the ranger station on his way back. Doug, the part-time maintenance contractor, was loading supplies into the storage shed when Joel pulled in. Doug was a large man in his late 40s who talked freely and meant well, and had the particular quality of cheerfulness that Joel associated with people who had never spent very much time alone. "You look like you walked into something," Doug said, without particular concern. Joel had learned that Doug said this most days, as a conversational entry point rather than a genuine question. "Long day," Joel said. "Get anything up in the dead zone?" That was what Doug called the Coldwater Creek sector. The dead zone, or occasionally the ghost posting. Not maliciously, just in the way that people assigned casual names to things they didn't take seriously. Trail maintenance. The cedars cleared. Good. Doug closed the shed. "I was asking about your quarterly report. Wants it end of week if possible." He paused, then added with the particular tone of a person who thought they were being helpful. "Between you and me, the earlier you get those in, the better it looks. You know, with everything going on." Joel said he'd have it done. He filed his notes and drove home. He ate standing over the sink, and then opened his laptop and searched historical records for the Coldwater Creek watershed. He had done this before in a general way without finding much of significance. Settlement in the area had been sparse. The early century logging operation had used the main river valley, not the high tributaries. A brief mineral survey from 1903 mentioned iron and copper traces in the basalt, nothing commercially significant. No homestead records for the immediate vicinity of the falls. He widened the search to county-level mining history. More appeared. Small-scale placer gold operations through the 1890s and early 1900s. Men working creek claims for a season or two before the returns stopped justifying the effort. Larger operations moving in through the 1910s and displacing the independent prospectors who had worked the area first. One name appeared in several accounts. A Norwegian-born mining engineer named Henrik Voss, documented working in the county between 1898 and approximately 1921, when he stopped appearing in public records entirely. One account described him as unusually skilled at reading geological formations. Another called him reclusive, preferring to work his claims alone, distrustful of the large mining companies beginning to dominate the region. A third, a brief mention in a county newspaper from 1908, described a dispute over a claim boundary in which Voss had prevailed in court, noting that he had produced survey documentation of unusual accuracy and detail, which the judge had found compelling. Joel searched further. He found a digitized archive of property transactions in the county through 1925. Henrik Voss had purchased a parcel of land in 1902, a remote acreage in the upper watershed, not far, Joel realized, from the Coldwater Creek sector's current boundary. He had paid cash, according to the transaction record. No mortgage, no debt holder, no institutional involvement of any kind. The land had been purchased outright by a man who apparently operated without banks whenever he could manage it. There was a small notice in a county newsletter from 1916, a routine publication that listed licensed mining operations, their claim holders, and their reported yields. Voss appeared on the list with a claim filed on a tributary of Coldwater Creek unnamed on the document, designated only by a survey coordinate that Joel converted on a secondary browser tab using a coordinates tool. The location put the claim approximately 2 miles upstream from the waterfall. He stared at that number for a long moment. 2 miles upstream. A man who worked alone, who understood geological formations in ways that impressed even people who dismissed him, who had purchased land outright and operated without institutional involvement, working a claim 2 miles above a waterfall that now had a hand-carved tunnel in its cliff face. After 1921, nothing. No death record. No property sale. No record of the land parcel changing hands through any transaction Joel could find in the digitized archives. No mention of Voss in any newspaper after a brief notice in early 1920 about a mining equipment purchase. No descendants listed. No forwarding address. No evidence of departure in any direction. A man who had worked this county for over 2 decades and then stopped existing in the documented sense. Joel sat with the name and closed his laptop and went to bed. He woke before his alarm. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the wind in the fir trees outside, and let his mind complete the work it had been doing through the night without him. The handholds and the mining claim 2 miles upstream, and the man who had purchased land outright in 1902 and stopped appearing in any record in 1921, these things had arranged themselves while he slept into a shape that had coherence. Not certainty, not the neat resolution of a concluded argument. Something closer to the way a trail reads when you understand the terrain well enough to know that the features you're looking at weren't produced by accident. He got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his field notebook open to the sketches he had made. The previous afternoon, he looked at the pattern of the cut handholds for a long time. He thought about the specific effort of cutting that pattern into basalt with a hand chisel. The time it would take. The physical strength required, sustained over many sessions, because you couldn't cut a climb route like that in an afternoon. The commitment the work implied. Not the work of a person acting impulsively or tentatively. The work of a person who had decided something and was carrying the decision through to its conclusion regardless of the labor required. A man who understood rock that well, who had spent decades reading geological formations, working claims alone, filing survey documentation precise enough to win court cases, would understand exactly how long basalt held its shape under a waterfall, how cold and stable the air in a deep rock chamber would stay, what materials would survive decades sealed in that environment, and what wouldn't. The gold bars made sense. Metal sealed in cold, stable air lasted indefinitely. The oilskin bundles made sense for paper materials. The timber and ironwork, of a quality he had seen in the door and the brackets and the shelf supports, made sense for a man with the skills and the patience to build well the first time. What didn't fit, yet, was the painting with the signature. He thought about that. He thought about where a reclusive Norwegian mining engineer working in the remote high country of Washington state in the early 20th century would have encountered a painting with that signature, and under what circumstances it would have ended up in his sealed chamber rather than in the collection where it belonged. He loaded his pack with more equipment than a standard patrol day required. The climbing harness from the back of the equipment closet, a rope, his camera, his headlamp, and 2 backup batteries. A pry bar he held in his hands for a moment before placing it in the pack. He told himself the hesitation was professional instinct, 23 years of not disturbing natural formations. But the handholds in that cliff face were not natural, and that changed the relevant standard. He reached the trailhead by 7:30, moving faster than his ordinary pace, the kind of pace the body produces when the mind has already decided something and is simply waiting for the legs to catch up. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The trail took him an hour and 40 minutes at speed. The toppled cedar lay where he'd left it, its root ball torn from the hillside and angled toward the sky, the cut end pale and fresh-smelling. He stepped past it without stopping. The falls came into hearing before they came into sight, the same way they always did, that low sustained layering of sound rising out of the ravine below the final descent. He went down the slope carefully, the trail wet with runoff from the previous day's rain, and by the time he reached the pool's edge his boots were dark with moisture and his jacket collar was already damp from the mist. The morning light was flat and direct, nothing like the raking afternoon angle that had revealed the handholds the previous day. Without the low light, the cuts were invisible again, the cliff face reading as uniformly dark and featureless. He went on memory and the sketch in his notebook to find the line. He located the lowest hold and crouched before it, tracing the carved edge with his fingertips. The mineral crust along the cut's inner surface was pale and fine, the product of years of mineral-rich mist. He pressed his thumb into the deepest part of a hold and felt the solid basalt behind the crust. He stood and put on his harness. The rope he tied off to a substantial boulder on the pool's east edge, the same rock he usually sat on. Not because the climb warranted a belay, it was steep but not vertical. The holds were cut for exactly this purpose, and the pool below was deep and clean, but because he was working alone 6 miles from the trailhead, and alone was the variable that changed every risk calculation. He removed his glasses and hung them on his shirt collar. Without them, the cliff face blurred slightly at the edges, but was navigable. He put both hands on the lowest hold and lifted his weight from the ground. The holds were cut for a person of roughly his height. The spacing suggested someone between 5'9" and 6 feet, a normal adult arm span. The depth gave good purchase on wet rock, more than he had expected. He found a rhythm after the first 3 moves, testing each hold completely before committing his weight to it, breathing evenly, keeping his center of gravity close to the rock face the way the terrain demanded. The mist thickened around the 6th hold. The leftmost thread of the falls was close now, close enough that the air itself was heavily saturated, and the rock under his palms was wet even where the falling water didn't directly reach. He could feel the cold of it through his skin, working inward. At the 12th hold, he stopped moving and looked left. The cliff face above him angled slightly inward, forming a shallow overhang that cut some of the direct mist and created a zone of relative shelter. In that shelter, the rock face did not continue flat and solid. It recessed inward at a depth that had nothing to do with natural erosion and everything to do with deliberate removal. The surface visible at the opening was smooth in the specific way worked stone was smooth, the parallel strokes of a chisel running across the grain of the rock in even rows, covering the entire interior surface he could see. A tunnel. The word arrived with a flatness that was its own kind of emphasis. He held the position for a moment, both hands locked on wet cold basalt, the falls roaring 6 feet to his right, water soaking through his jacket at the collar. He looked at the entrance to something that should not, by any logic he had previously applied to this cliff face, have been there. Then he descended, methodically, hand by hand, until his feet were on the pool's edge rock. He unclipped the rope and stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the falls from below. He stood for a long time. Then he took what he needed from his pack, checked the headlamp battery with 2 short clicks, and went back up. The second climb was steadier than the first. He knew the holds now. He knew which ones were slicker than they appeared and which had enough purchase to hold his weight confidently. He moved up the line with deliberate rhythm, pausing at each hold only long enough to breathe and confirm his grip, his attention entirely on the sequence of moves. At the top of the line, he shifted his weight to his right foot and angled his body toward the entrance. He switched on his headlamp. The beam cut into the shadow behind the fall's curtain and landed on a worked stone wall approximately 8 feet in. The tunnel ran straight for that distance before bending left at a shallow angle that blocked the sight line from the entrance. The ceiling was low enough to require ducking. The floor was wet from wall seepage but ran very slightly upward in grade, which meant the interior would be drier the deeper it went. He tested the floor with 1 foot before putting his weight on it. Solid stone. He tucked his head and entered. Inside, the falls changed from a sound in the air to a vibration in the rock. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, through his palm on the tunnel wall, a sustained, low-frequency resonance. the water conducting its energy through the basalt in a way that was more physical than audible. The tunnel smelled of wet stone and cold, and something else below that, something dry and old. The particular smell of spaces that have been sealed a very long time. The tool marks were everywhere on the walls. Regular parallel strokes cut across the grain of the basalt in neat rows, each one the product of sustained effort with a hand tool. The consistency of the marks indicated the same worker, the same technique, maintained over a significant period. To cut this length of tunnel into basalt by hand, and he was already estimating the work at 40 to 60 linear feet beyond the entrance, would have taken months. More likely the better part of a year, working in isolation, in cold, in the dark except for whatever light a person could carry into a narrow space in the early years of the century. He walked the first 8 feet and turned left at the bend. His headlamp beam found the door. He stopped. It was set into a frame of rough-hewn timber braced against the tunnel walls with iron brackets and square-headed bolts. The wood was nearly black with age and moisture, but it was structurally sound. He could see no rot, no collapse, no significant deterioration in the frame's joints. The cold, stable air of the tunnel's interior had preserved it the way consistently cold and stable environments preserved organic material by removing the conditions that broke things down. The door was held by a wrought iron bar dropped through 2 brackets. Simple, effective, requiring no lock because the rail security was the waterfall and the cliff face, and however many decades had passed since anyone had climbed those handholds. He looked at the bar for a moment before touching it. The brackets were hand-forged. He could see the hammer marks in the iron where it had been shaped while hot. The bolts were set square, driven with care. The bar itself was approximately 18 inches, solid iron, heavy. Whoever had built this place had worked in metal the same way they had worked in rock and wood, with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the work needed to last a long time without anyone maintaining it. He put his hand on the bar and lifted. It came up smoothly. The cold metal left a faint reddish-brown dusting on his palm. He drew the bar from the brackets and set it carefully against the tunnel wall. He pushed the door. It opened inward on heavy hinges, slowly, with the stiff deliberation of a mechanism that was still functionally sound but had not moved in a very long time. He put his shoulder to the door, added his weight, and it swung fully open. The chamber beyond the door was larger than the tunnel by a significant margin. He stood at the threshold and let the headlamp beam sweep across it before entering. 20 feet across, 12 or 13 feet at the highest point of the ceiling, which was domed, shaped from the rock with careful attention to structural soundness. The tool marks ran in a consistent grid pattern across the ceiling, indicating methodical work done in stages. Whoever had built this had expanded outward from the tunnel in careful layers, maintaining the arch overhead as they went, understanding that a ceiling cut wrong would fail under the weight of the rock above it. He stepped inside. The resonance of the falls was different in the chamber than in the tunnel. In the tunnel, it had been directional, coming from the entrance behind him. In the chamber, it came from everywhere at once, conducted through the surrounding rock in all directions equally, a sustained low vibration that he felt more in his sternum and the soles of his feet than in his ears. It was the sound of a room built inside something alive. He had felt a version of this once before, in a lava tube in Central Oregon, the particular sensation of stone that was not entirely still. He stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, the headlamp beam moving with him. Along 3 of the 4 walls, from the floor to a height of approximately 6 feet, were shelves. The same dark preserved wood, the same iron brackets, the same square bolt precision. 3 tiers on each wall, built to last and full. He stood at the threshold and moved the beam slowly along the nearest wall, left to right. On the lowest shelf, 9 metal containers. Rectangular, roughly the size of a modest piece of luggage. Sealed with hinged clasps, the metal a dull gray, aged but not corroded through, the kind of material that maintained its integrity when stored cold and dry for a long time. On the middle shelf, bundles wrapped in oilskin, tied with cord. Dozens of them, stacked in flat, neat rows. The oilskin had darkened to a tobacco brown but held its structure. The bundles were the size and shape of documents. Folded maps, bound paper materials of various types. On the top shelf, smaller boxes, some wooden, some metal, arranged with the same considered organization as everything below, placed with care, not stacked carelessly. The second wall held more containers. Different sizes, different arrangements, but the same evident deliberateness in how they had been stored. The fourth wall, directly facing the door, was different from the others. He crossed the chamber floor, his boots making no sound on the worked stone, and stopped in front of it. For paintings, hung on iron hooks set directly into the rock face. The same wrought iron, handmade, the same maker's hand evident in the hooks as in the brackets. The frames were simple, raw-edged timber, undecorated, built for function rather than display. But what the frames held was not simple. The paintings were oils. Even under headlamp light, in the cold, closed air of the chamber, the colors held. The first, a northern forest, dark firs against a pale winter sky, rendered in tones that suggested a painter who had looked at that kind of light many times and understood it in a technical sense. The second, a portrait, a man seated at a table, dark clothing, a composed expression, the face painted with the specific attention given to someone whose features were worth recording permanently. The third, a harbor, boats at anchor in gray water, light on the surface, the kind of light that moved and changed as the painter watched. The fourth was different from the others in manner and period, working in shapes and tones that suggested rather than depicted, the work of a different sensibility or a different time. He leaned toward the portrait and aimed the headlamp at its lower right corner. The grime of a century had settled across the painted surface, fine and uniform, the color of old dust. Through it, barely, he could make out a signature. 2 words, a first initial and a surname. He read it once. He read it a second time, making sure his eyes had done what he thought they had done. He straightened and stood with his headlamp aimed away from the painting at the worked stone wall to the left of it, because he needed a moment to let the thinking catch up with the seeing. He had spent 23 years developing the professional habit of not reaching conclusions before the evidence supported them. It was a useful habit, and he applied it now, deliberately, working through the steps. What the signature appeared to say. What a painting with that signature would represent in terms of documented location and value. Whether there was another, simpler explanation he was missing because he was standing in a sealed stone chamber behind a waterfall and his mind was running significantly faster than normal. He returned the headlamp beam to the signature and read it a third time. He knew the name, not from personal acquaintance, not from any context close to his ordinary life, but from the kind of general cultural knowledge that accumulated in a person who read regularly and had once spent a February weekend in Seattle's Art Museum with Darlene before the children were born, back when they still did things like that. He knew the name the way he knew names from history books and museum placards. Distantly, but certainly. A painting with that signature had a location. It had documentation. It had a provenance that placed it somewhere else entirely, in the care of someone who knew what it was and what it was worth. He stood back from the portrait. He looked at the chamber in its entirety. The 3 walls of shelves. The organized containers. The oilskin bundles. The smaller boxes on the upper shelves. The 4 paintings on the facing wall. The domed ceiling worked with methodical care. The door on its heavy hinges, preserved by cold and stability through however many decades had passed since someone had set the iron bar into its brackets and climbed back down the cliff face and left this place to hold its contents in the dark. He moved to the nearest wall and crouched before one of the sealed containers. The clasp was stiff, requiring firm, steady pressure before it yielded. The mechanism was not rusted through. It moved cleanly, the engineering still sound, and the lid came up. Inside, nested in dried straw that had held its original arrangement through the decades, were gold bars. He counted 6 visible without disturbing the straw. Each one bore a stamped mark, a maker's mark, ornate, deliberate, the kind used by a private foundry operating in an era before standardized government hallmarking was universally enforced. Below the maker's mark, on each bar, was a weight notation. Old notation, not modern, in a format that matched the period of the mineral surveys he had read the previous night. He looked at the bars for a moment. Then he closed the container carefully, the clasp seating back into position with the same clean resistance it had taken to open, and he stood. His headlamp moved across the chamber one final time, wall to wall, shelf to shelf, container to container. The 4 paintings, the 9 containers on the nearest shelf and the ones on the walls to either side. The dozens of oilskin bundles on the middle shelves, the smaller boxes whose contents he had not yet seen. He thought about Henrik Voss, the Norwegian mining engineer who had stopped appearing in public records in 1921 after more than 2 decades of working this county alone, distrustful of the large operations, unusually skilled at reading geological formations. A man who had produced survey documentation of unusual accuracy and detail, according to a newspaper account from 1908. A man who had vanished from the documented record without a death notice, without a property sale, without any evidence of where he had gone or why. A man who had understood rock and iron and wood and patience and the value of concealment. Joel stood in the center of the chamber and breathed. The air was cold and still and carried the faint dry smell of everything preserved in this place for longer than he had been alive. The headlamp cast his shadow long across the worked stone floor. He did not take anything. He looked at the containers and the bundles and the paintings and the 6 gold bars visible in their bed of dried straw, and he did not take anything. He stepped back through the door, pulled it closed behind him with both hands, replaced the iron bar in its brackets with care, and walked the length of the tunnel in measured steps until he came out into the full sound and cold spray of the falls. He descended the handholds without hurrying. He reached the pool's edge and stood. The falls ran 60 feet above him, the same way they had run for longer than anyone currently living had been watching them. The same threads of water catching the morning light. The same mist drifting out across the surface of the pool. The same green water. The same mosses on the dark rock. The same firs leaning inward from both walls of the ravine. He stood with his field notebook open in one hand and wrote for 10 minutes without stopping. Everything he could record with precision. Dimensions, materials, shelf contents as observed, the oilskin bundles, the smaller boxes, the painting subjects and their arrangement, the signature on the portrait, the maker's marks on the gold bars, the condition of the timber and ironwork, the grade and length of the tunnel, the age of the handholds as estimated from the mineral deposition on their cut edges. He wrote the name Henrik Voss at the top of the first page, a question mark beside it. Notes to check the 1903 mineral survey, the county mining records, the newspaper archives for anything about Voss after 1921. He capped the pen and put the notebook away and put on his pack. The walk back to the trailhead was 6 miles. He covered it in less than 2 hours, moving at a pace that was faster than his ordinary return speed, not from urgency exactly, but from the particular energy of a mind that had encountered something it was still in the process of understanding. He thought about the chamber. He thought about the paintings and the containers and the organization of the shelves, the evidence of a person who had built something meant to last without any expectation of returning to it soon. He thought about the signature on the portrait and what its presence in a sealed stone chamber behind a waterfall in the remote high country of Washington state implied about how it had gotten there and what it meant that it had been there this long. He thought about what was in those oilskin bundles. Documents, most likely, based on their flat rectangular profile. Maps, surveys, records of some kind. The work of a man who documented things meticulously, who had produced survey materials precise enough to impress a county judge. A man working a gold claim 2 miles upstream, who understood geological formations and worked alone and purchased land in cash and disappeared from all public records in 1921 without leaving a trail. He thought about what was in the smaller boxes on the upper shelves, the ones he hadn't opened, the ones whose contents he couldn't infer from their exterior. He thought about the 9 large sealed containers on the first wall and the additional ones on the second wall, and what they held besides gold bars and dried straw. He thought about Hal Briggs and the early retirement, and the phrase changed significantly. He thought about Doug calling the Coldwater Creek sector the dead zone, the same casual dismissal that had accumulated across 3 years from people who had decided without looking that there was nothing in 42 square miles of remote high country worth the labor of knowing it well. He thought about 23 years of work at a salary that had never been generous and savings thinned by his mother's final year, and a knee that complained on stairs, and a back that had been complaining for 4 years already. He thought about Henrik Voss, a man who had worked this county alone for over 2 decades, who had built a tunnel by hand into a cliff face behind a waterfall, who had organized a chamber with the care of a person who understood that quality work lasted and careless work didn't, who had then stopped appearing in any record anywhere in 1921 and never reappeared. The land parcel Voss had purchased in 1902 had never been sold. It had simply stopped appearing in any record of ownership or transaction, the way things stopped appearing in records when nobody living knew they needed to keep track of them. Nobody had been keeping track. Joel reached the trailhead as the last of the morning's flat light was giving way to the warmer angle of midday. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. The school photos caught what light came through the windshield. Cassie at 10, Marcus at 8, squinting at the camera. Joel looked at them briefly, the way he always did. He had kept those photos on the dash for 3 years. Not to remind himself of the time when things were different, or to perform the role of a father for an audience that wasn't there. More because the faces of his children at ages when they still found the world genuinely surprising were a useful counterweight to the kind of thinking that settled in during the long, quiet miles. The thinking that said a life built around solitude and careful observation of a landscape nobody valued was a narrow thing. That the work was ending and not much of lasting consequence would remain. He had driven this road on those mornings and believed some version of that, and he had walked into the sector and felt the specific rightness of the work, and the contradiction had simply been something he carried. Unresolved. Part of the weight. He looked at the tree line where the trail disappeared into the canopy. 42 square miles of terrain that most people had written off as empty. Terrain he had walked for 3 years, carefully, without expectation, in the manner of a person who had accounted for what was there. He had been wrong about what he had accounted for. He understood that now with a completeness that moved through his chest and settled there, like something that had been in transit for a long time and had finally found where it was going. He put the truck in gear and drove. That night Joel sat at his kitchen table with his field notebook open and the lamp on, and a cup of tea he had made and not drunk, and he worked through it the way he worked through most difficult things methodically, without hurrying, examining each piece before moving to the next. The 3 pages of notes from the falls were spread in front of him. His sketches of the handhold pattern, the chamber dimensions he had estimated by pacing, the shelf arrangement, the contents of the 1 container he had opened, the 4 paintings on the far wall, the name on the portrait in the lower right corner. He was a forest ranger. He had been a forest ranger for 23 years. In those years he had found things that needed reporting: dead animals, illegal campsites, a buried cache of hunting equipment left by a poacher who had been working the sector before Joel's arrival, and he had reported them the way the work required, clearly and without embellishment, and the appropriate authorities had handled them appropriately. The work had a structure. He understood the structure and operated within it. What he had found behind the waterfall did not fit cleanly into the structure. He looked at the name on the portrait. He had photographed it before leaving the chamber, and the image was on his camera, the small digital model he kept in the waterproof case. He had looked at the image 4 times since getting home. Each time the signature said the same thing. The same first initial. The same surname. The same 2 words that put a painting by a specific hand in a sealed stone chamber in a remote sector that no one but Joel had visited in years. He thought about what the reporting process looked like if he followed it in sequence. He would call the district office and speak to Hal Briggs or leave a message for him. He would describe what he had found. Hal would ask for a written report. Joel would file the report through the standard system. The report would be reviewed, escalated as appropriate, and eventually some combination of federal and state agencies would dispatch people to the location to assess the situation and take over. At which point Joel would return to driving 12 miles of logging road to a job that was in the process of ending, and the chamber behind the waterfall would belong to a process that had nothing to do with him. He thought about whether that troubled him. He examined the thought honestly, the way the terrain required. It did. More than was purely rational, more than a person his age with his history of prioritizing the work over his own position in it should probably admit. Something about the chamber troubled him in a way he couldn't fully account for in practical terms. It wasn't the gold. It wasn't even the painting. It was the room itself. The specific quality of what it represented: a man working alone for years, cutting stone by hand, building shelves and ironwork with the precision of someone who understood permanence. Building something meant to last in a place so well chosen that it had lasted a century, undisturbed, until a 51-year-old ranger with a bad back and a failing career happened to be standing at a pool's edge in late September when the light came in at exactly the right angle. Henrik Voss had built that room and then disappeared. The room had waited. Joel had found it. He wasn't ready, yet, for the room to belong to a process. If you're enjoying this story so far, Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He closed the notebook and went to bed and slept better than he had in 2 months, which surprised him when he woke and understood that it was true. In the morning, he called the district office before 7. Hal Briggs would not be in until 8:30. Lynn's recorded message confirmed. Joel left a message asking Hal to call him back at his earliest convenience, the phrase that signaled some urgency without claiming an emergency. He did not leave details. Then he drove to the county seat. The drive was 40 minutes on the highway, through terrain that flattened progressively as the Cascade foothills gave way to the wider valley. The county seat was a town of approximately 18,000, the kind of place that had a main street with a hardware store, a family-owned pharmacy, 2 banks, a diner, a coffee shop that had appeared in the last decade and charged more than the diner for the same size cup. The County Historical Society occupied a building on the east side of the main street, a 2-story structure that had been a general store in the 1890s and had been meticulously maintained in the way that historical societies maintained the buildings they occupied, with an attention to exterior detail that exceeded what the interior budget actually warranted. Joel had been here once before, in his first year in the sector, looking for historical maps of the watershed that might tell him something about drainage patterns before the mid-century logging. He had found the maps. He had also found the archivist, a woman named Margaret Cole who had been the Historical Society's director of collections for longer than Joel had been a ranger, and who had the particular quality of attentiveness that people who worked with documents developed over decades of stillness, a preference for accuracy over speed, a habit of asking one question at a time and waiting for the complete answer before forming the next one. She was at her desk when he came in, the front door's bell producing a small, clean sound in the quiet building. She looked up over reading glasses and recognized him with the slight adjustment of expression that indicated she had placed him as a previous visitor without being certain of the context. "The ranger," she said. "Watershed maps." "For years ago," Joel said. "Give or take." "I remember." She took off her reading glasses. "What is it this time?" He sat down across from her desk. He had thought about how to approach this on the drive over. The full story was more than he was prepared to share with someone he didn't know well until he understood more of it himself. But he needed what Margaret Cole had access to, and to get it he needed to give her enough of a reason. "I'm doing research on a historical figure who worked in this county between roughly 1898 and 1921, he said. "Norwegian-born mining engineer. Name of Henrik Voss. I've found some mentions in newspaper archives and county mining records, but I've hit a limit on what I can access remotely. I'm looking for anything more substantial. Personal records, correspondence, claim records, anything with more depth than what the digitized materials carry." Margaret Cole's expression didn't change. This was a specific skill of hers, Joel remembered from the previous visit. She received information without reacting to it, which was either the habit of a person who had heard a great deal over a long career and had stopped being surprised, or the professional caution of someone who understood that her reaction often shaped what people told her next. "Henrik Voss," she repeated. "You know the name?" She stood without answering and moved toward the filing cabinets along the far wall. The Historical Society's collection occupied 2 rooms behind the front office, accessible through a doorway hung with a cloth curtain that had been there long enough to fade at the edges. She disappeared through the curtain and came back 3 minutes later carrying a cardboard file box with a label on its side that read Voss. H. Mining/miscellaneous. She set it on the desk between them. "We have a collection," she said, sitting back down. "Donated in 1987 by the estate of a woman named Astrid Voss Hendricks. She was Henrik Voss's niece. Norwegian community in Seattle. She had a box of his papers she'd held on to for decades and didn't know what to do with. Her daughter contacted us when she died." Margaret folded her hands on the desk. "Nobody has asked about Henrik Voss since 1994. Joel looked at the box. "Who asked in 1994? "A graduate student. History thesis, University of Washington. Early Northwest mining, corporate consolidation period." She photocopied a few documents and left. "The thesis, if it was ever completed, was never sent to us." A pause. "Why are you interested in him?" "Something came up in my sector that might be connected to his work in the area," Joel said. "I'm trying to understand the full picture before I file a report." It was true, and it was not complete, and he was aware of both things as he said it. Margaret Cole's expression suggested she understood the same, but she opened the file box and began sorting through it with the practiced efficiency of a person who had organized other people's histories for a long time. The box contained several categories of material. Correspondence letters in Norwegian, a few in English, some on letterhead from assay offices and mining companies, and one from a law firm in Seattle. Survey maps, hand-drawn, on paper that had aged to a deep ivory color but remained legible. A small leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth with handling. Several newspaper clippings, the same kind Joel had found in the digitized archives, plus additional ones from Norwegian-language community papers that had not been scanned. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of cloth that had been folded carefully and secured with a rubber band that had long since crumbled to powder, a series of photographs. Joel reached for the photographs. Margaret Cole watched, her hands still. There were 7 of them. Sepia-toned, printed on heavy cardstock, the kind of professional portrait photographs that people had made when photographs were still a deliberate and significant occasion rather than a casual one. 6 of them showed a man alone or with mining equipment at a claim site, holding tools, standing at the entrance to a tunnel cut into rock. The 7th showed the same man seated at a table in what appeared to be a modest interior, bookshelves behind him, a lamp to one side. His expression composed and direct, looking at the camera with the patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting. Joel looked at the photograph for a long time. The man in the portrait photograph was seated at a table. Dark clothing, a composed expression, the face rendered with attention by a photographer who had understood that the subject's features were worth recording with care. He put the photograph down and looked at the next one, the one that showed the man at a tunnel entrance. The tunnel was cut into rock. The rock was basalt. The cut marks on the tunnel walls were visible in the photograph, regular parallel strokes across the grain of the stone, every one of them identical to what Joel had walked through 2 days ago behind the waterfall. He sat with both photographs in front of him for a long moment. He set the tunnel photograph down and looked at the man at the table again, the composed expression, the patience in the face, the bookshelves in the background. He cut tunnels, Joel said. He was a mining engineer, Margaret said. That was the work. He was working a claim on a tributary of Coldwater Creek. Upper Watershed. Around 1916, he had a claim filed there. I found the reference in a county newsletter. Margaret took out several of the hand-drawn survey maps and spread them on the desk, handling them with gloved fingertips. Each map covered a section of terrain drawn to a scale that a trained eye could read. Joel had spent 23 years reading terrain. He looked at the survey lines and the drainage notations and the way the contour intervals arranged themselves, and felt the recognition arrive in his chest before he consciously articulated it. This is Coldwater Creek, he said. This is my sector. Margaret looked at him steadily. You're certain? The drainage profile. The way the tributary branches at this elevation. I've walked that ground in every season for 3 years. He pointed without touching the paper. This feature here is a series of drops in the creek bed about 1.5 miles below the main waterfall. She was quiet for a moment. She put the maps carefully to one side and reached into the box for the leather-bound ledger. She opened it carefully, the binding stiff but intact, and turned through the pages with the gentleness of a person who had handled other people's documents for decades. The handwriting inside was precise and small, in Norwegian, with numbers in columns down the right side of many pages. Joel couldn't read Norwegian, but he could read numbers, and the numbers in the columns were not trivial. His personal accounts, Margaret said, reading. In Norwegian. She paused at a page, then another. He was meticulous. Claims, yields, expenses, material purchases. She turned several pages more. The entries stop in September 1921. He disappeared in 1921. He didn't disappear exactly. She had found something. She held the ledger at an angle to the window light and read carefully, her lips moving slightly in the way of a person translating under their breath. The last entries describe a dispute with a company called Pacific Consolidated Mining. They had been acquiring claims in the upper watershed since 1918, and they wanted his. He had refused to sell. He describes, she paused, reading more slowly, legal pressure. Someone filing competing surveys. Men at the boundary of his claim who he didn't recognize. She turned the page. And then a note. September 12, 1921. 3 words in Norwegian. Jeg har valgt. I have chosen. She closed the ledger. The building was very quiet around them. Outside, the main street traffic moved at its unhurried pace. A truck, a car, someone's footsteps on the sidewalk. Someone laughed on the street outside, brief and cheerful, a sound from a different kind of afternoon entirely. Is there anything about what he found? Joel asked. In the accounts. What the yield numbers actually represent. Margaret put on her glasses and turned back through the ledger pages, reading more slowly this time, column by column. She stopped twice and made a notation in her own small pad beside the desk. When she looked up, her expression had the quality of a person who has confirmed something that surprised her more than she expected it to. The reported yields in the county filing records were modest, she said carefully. The numbers in this ledger are not. She set the ledger down. He was reporting a fraction of what he was actually extracting. Legally, that would have been significant. But practically, if the company filing those competing surveys understood what the claim was actually producing, it explains why they wanted it badly enough to send men to the boundary. There was also, at the bottom of the file box, a small envelope unsealed and tucked behind the survey maps. Inside were 3 index cards in a different hand, a looser, more hurried script than Voss's. The niece's own notes. Her attempt to summarize what she had inherited without fully knowing what it meant. Joel read through the 3 cards carefully. Most of it was incomplete and partly speculative. But one sentence on the second card made him read the line twice. Uncle Henrik told my mother once that he had found something that would outlast the men who wanted to take it from him, and that he had put it somewhere the mountain would keep until he came back for it. Joel set the cards down. He never came back, Margaret said. No, Joel said. She looked at him with the considered steadiness of a person who had spent a long career reading between lines in historical documents and had learned that what was not written was often as significant as what was. Whatever you found in your sector, she said, I hope you're being careful. Not just physically. A pause. Things that have been waiting that long tend to attract people who weren't part of the waiting. Did he ever resurface? Joel asked. Any record of him after September 1921? Not in what we have here. The niece's notes with the donation say only that Henrik left suddenly and the family lost contact. They assumed he had gone back to Norway, but no record of him was ever found there either. She set the ledger on the desk beside the photographs. He was 53 in 1921. He had been in this country for 23 years. He had no family here, no close associates that the community papers mention. He was, by all accounts, a man who preferred to be alone. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Joel drove back to the ranger station in the early afternoon with a folder of photocopies Margaret Cole had made from the box without being asked. The photographs, several pages of the ledger's Norwegian entries she had translated by hand in her precise and careful handwriting while he waited, and the 3 most significant letters from the correspondence file. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. He thought about what she had said last. Things that have been waiting that long tend to attract people who weren't part of the waiting. He understood that she was being careful, offering a caution without the specific context to make it concrete. The way a person with experience of how these situations unfolded might warn someone without wanting to alarm them. He thought she was right. He thought she was probably right in ways he hadn't fully worked out yet. Doug was finishing up his afternoon at the tool shed when Joel came in. He had been replacing weather stripping on the supply room door, and the remains of the old material were piled on the floor beside him in long strips, the adhesive side gray and brittle with age. Long day for you, Doug said. Not particularly curious. Just filling the air. Research day, Joel said. Research. Doug said the word in a way that was not quite skeptical and not quite amused, but occupied the space between those things. In the field, County Historical Society. Going full historian on us. Doug bent back to his work. I heard how saying you found some old structure up in the dead zone. Some kind of cabin thing. He pulled a strip of old weather stripping free with a sound like tape coming off a surface that didn't want to give it up. We had a ranger in Sector 7 find a trapper's shelter a couple years back. All the way up by the ridge boundary. Took 3 months of paperwork to get it flagged as a historical point of interest. 3 months. He shook his head. Hope yours isn't going to be like that. It's more complicated than a trapper's shelter, Joel said. Always is. Doug stood and stretched his back, the way men of a certain age stretched after crouching too long. Well, for what it's worth, I think it's kind of neat you've got yourself a project up there. Keep you busy while they figure out the restructuring. He said this without a hint of cruelty, which somehow made it land harder than cruelty would have. Just a man who had decided the situation was resolved and was treating Joel's discovery as a retirement hobby. Joel filed his daily report and drove home. The letters were from the law firm in Seattle, dated 1919 and 1920. Two of them outlined Pacific Consolidated Mining's legal claim to portions of the watershed under federal mining expansion provisions passed in the post-war period. The third was Voss's response through his own legal representation, a single page, point by point, methodical, refusing every offer and disputing every claim. In the margin, in pencil that had faded to near invisibility, someone had written a single line in English. Joel had to hold the photocopy under the kitchen lamp to read it. The words were, "They will not have what I have found." He was sitting at his desk reading the translation notes when Hal Briggs returned his call. "Got your message," Hal said. His voice had its usual quality of a man managing more concurrent obligations than he had time for. "What's the situation?" Joel had spent the drive back from the county seat deciding how to describe the situation to Hal. He had considered the various approaches and their probable outcomes. He had settled on the approach most likely to get him what he needed, which was access and time and the space to understand what he was dealing with before the process took over. He told how he had found an undocumented historical structure on the Coldwater Creek cliff face, possibly from the early 20th century, and that he needed a few additional days to assess it properly before filing a full report. He said the structure appeared significant enough to warrant careful documentation. Hal was quiet for a moment. "What kind of structure?" "A built space, cut into rock, timber and ironwork that could be from the 1910s or 1920s. I'd like to document it thoroughly before bringing anyone else in." "Documented how?" "You're not an archaeologist, Joel." "I know. I'm doing basic field documentation. Photographs, measurements, written notes. I'll have it ready for a proper assessment." Another silence. "How does a built structure end up in a cliff face in a closed trail sector?" "That's what I'm trying to understand." Hal made the sound of a man whose schedule had no room for this, but whose position required him to engage with it. "Fine. File your standard patrol reports as normal and send me a preliminary write-up by end of next week. Don't disturb anything structurally." "Understood." "And Joel." "Hey, pause. Is this the kind of thing that's going to generate paperwork?" "I don't know yet," Joel said honestly. He heard Hal exhale. "Keep me informed." He hung up and sat for a moment. Then he pulled up his email and found the address. He was looking for a contact at the Seattle Art Museum he had encountered once at a regional conference 3 years back, a conservator named Patricia Sunday, who had been presenting on field preservation of discovered materials. They had spoken briefly about his sector, about the particular preservation conditions that cold, stable environments created, and she had given him her card. He had kept it in the back of his wallet without knowing why. He wrote her a careful email. He described, without naming the location, a sealed cold chamber discovered in a historical structure. He described 4 paintings in simple timber frames hung on iron hooks. He described the portrait, specifically the seated figure in dark clothing, the composed expression, the painted face rendered with the attention given to a formal subject. He described the signature in the lower right corner and the 2 words it appeared to say. He also described the 4th painting, the one that differed from the others in period and approach, working in shapes and tones that suggested rather than depicted the work of a different sensibility. He noted that the 4th had no visible signature at all, only what appeared to be a small notation in pencil on the back of the timber frame, partially obscured by the frame's attachment to the iron hook. He asked if she could help him confirm what he thought he was reading, and whether the 4th and signed piece might be identifiable by style and period. He attached 3 photographs from his camera. The portrait, the signature close-up, the harbor scene with enough detail to be read clearly, and 1 photograph of the 4th painting, the abstract one, shot as close as the chamber's lighting allowed. He sent the email. He went home and ate dinner at the table instead of standing over the sink, because some small thing in the quality of the day seemed to require it. He cooked pasta he had in the cabinet and ate it with sauce from a jar and sat looking at the photocopies of Henrik Voss's photographs, the man at his table, the man at his tunnel entrance, The man who had cut handholds into a basalt cliff face and built a chamber behind a waterfall, and then written 3 words in Norwegian in the last entry of his ledger and disappeared from every record that had tried to track him. I have chosen. He went back to the falls the following morning. The night before, he had sat with the translation notes from Margaret's hand and read through Voss's ledger entries as she had rendered them, line by line, the meticulous columns of a man who had spent 23 years converting labor into record. The numbers were striking, but what struck Joel more was the consistency of the method. Every expense noted, every material purchased, every yield entry logged with precision, even as the ledger's last section revealed that the numbers being reported to the county were a fraction of the actual totals. Voss had kept 2 sets of records not from dishonesty in the ordinary sense, but from the kind of defensive accuracy practiced by a man who understood that what he had found would be taken from him if anyone realized its full extent. He had documented everything, for himself, for the record no one else would see, for whoever found this before he returned. Joel had thought about that phrase through most of the night, not anxiously, with the specific quality of attention that he brought to problems that required more understanding before they could be addressed. Voss had chosen his words in English, not Norwegian. He had addressed no specific person. He had simply acknowledged the possibility that someone would come, and that when they did, what they found should be understood as the sum of an honest man's labor. Not abandoned property, not an unclaimed cash. Labor, the product of a life's work, hidden rather than surrendered, preserved rather than lost. He brought more equipment this time. A larger waterproof bag, better lighting, a headlamp with a wider beam, and a separate handheld lantern that produced enough light to work in without relying entirely on the narrow beam of a headlamp. His camera with a fresh battery. The photocopied translation of Voss's ledger entries that Margaret had prepared in a sealed plastic sleeve. He reached the pool by 9. The morning light was direct and flat again, the same as his second visit, the handholds invisible from below until he climbed close enough to feel the familiar cool stone beneath his fingers. He went up at a steady pace, confident in the route now, and ducked through the entrance into the cold, resonant dark of the tunnel. At the door he stood for a moment before lifting the bar. He thought about what Margaret Cole had read from the ledger. They will not have what I have found. A man who had built this room to protect something so significant that the threat of losing it to a mining company had produced a response in the margins of a legal letter in a language not his own, in English, as if the weight of the statement required a language that had no other associations for him, no daily use that might dilute it. What Voss had found was what Joel had walked into. He lifted the bar and went inside. In the chamber, he lit the handheld lantern and set it on the floor in the center of the room. The wider light changed the space significantly. Where the headlamp's narrow beam had created focused pools of visibility surrounded by dark, the lantern produced a broad, even illumination that reached the full extent of the chamber simultaneously. He could see all 4 walls, all 3 tiers of shelving, all the contained and wrapped and organized contents of the room in one look. The full scope of it. He stood for a moment just looking. He had estimated 20 containers on the first visit. Looking now with the lantern's fuller light, he counted more carefully. 27 metal containers on 2 walls. 6 of them the larger suitcase-size units he had noted on his first visit, the rest smaller, the size of a large hardcover book. On the middle shelves, 41 oilskin bundles that he could count from where he stood. The smaller boxes on the upper shelves numbered 19. And on the far wall, the 4 paintings on their iron hooks. He had opened one container on his first visit and found gold bars. He moved now to the second container on the same shelf, opened it with the same careful pressure on the clasp, and lifted the lid. More gold bars, 6 again, the same maker's marks, the same weight notations. He closed the container and opened a third. This one held something different. Leather pouches, small, each one closed with a drawstring, each one lying in its own formed hollow in the straw. He lifted the first pouch and felt its weight and density before he opened it. He had never held an uncut diamond in his hand before. The stone that came out of the pouch was irregular, roughly the size of a large grape, pale with an internal quality that registered as light even in the cool illumination of the lantern. He set it on his palm and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it carefully back and closed the pouch and counted the pouches in the container. 9. He closed the container and straightened. He crossed to the middle shelves and took down the nearest oilskin bundle. The cord around it had dried and stiffened, but was not fragile. He untied it slowly and opened the oilskin. Inside were papers. Not loose sheets, but folded pages, carefully ordered, held together by a clip made of bent wire. The paper had aged to the same deep ivory as the ledger in Margaret Cole's collection. The handwriting was the same small, precise hand from the ledger's photographs. Norwegian throughout, with the occasional technical term in English claim coordinates, mineral names, geological designations. Survey notes. Detailed, systematic, the kind of record that accumulated over years of careful work in a specific location. He handled them with the same care Margaret had shown with the ledger, touching only the edges, keeping them as flat as their folded condition allowed. He opened a second bundle. More survey notes, but from a different period, the paper slightly different, the handwriting the same but more compressed, as if the writer had understood by then that paper was a resource to be used efficiently. Among the survey pages, folded separately, were letter drafts. In English, he could read these. The first letter was addressed to a lawyer in Seattle. It was dated March 1920. Voss described, with the precision of a man who understood legal language but was not trained in it, the company's attempts to acquire his claim through what he called systematic falsification of survey boundaries. He described 2 specific incidents in which company representatives had altered marker positions on his claim perimeter. He described a third incident in which he had arrived at his claim site to find that someone had removed a section of his equipment, forcing him to spend 3 days retrieving and replacing it 3 days during which the company's own surveyors had been active in the same watershed. The letter was a draft. He could not know if it had been sent. The second letter, also a draft, was addressed to no one, or rather, to a name followed by a blank, as if Voss had not yet determined the specific recipient when he began writing. It read, "What I have taken years to find and build is not their property by any law I recognize. I have secured it in the manner best suited to what I know of this country and this stone. If something happens to me before I return for it, the location is," and here the letter ended. Mid-sentence. The next line of the draft began again with a different subject, as if Voss had thought better of that particular commitment and pulled back from completing it. Joel sat on the chamber floor with the lantern beside him and the letters in his hands, and understood more clearly what he had been putting together piece by piece since the afternoon the light came in at the right angle. Henrik Voss had found gold. Not the small placer returns that the county newsletter had suggested in its 1916 listing. Something significantly more substantial. He had worked his claim for years in deliberate secrecy, reporting modest yields to the licensing records while the real extent of what he was finding stayed off the books. He had converted some portion of his actual findings into portable forms, refined gold bars, cut and uncut stones, and he had added to his holdings things of other kinds, the paintings among them, through means that the ledger hadn't yet explained. He had built the chamber with the understanding that at some point he might need to leave the claim behind in a way that preserved everything he had accumulated. When Pacific Consolidated Mining began their legal campaign in 1918, the risk he had been anticipating arrived. He had spent 1919 and 1920 fighting it legally and documenting the company's tactics. By September 1921, he had reached the end of that road. 3 words in the ledger. "I have chosen." He had walked away, or been forced out, or something else had happened that left the chamber sealed and everything in it untouched for 103 years. Joel sat with that in the cold, still air of the chamber and let the full weight of what it meant settle into him at its own pace. He was looking at the product of a man's entire working life. Not just the gold and the stones, but the survey work, the correspondence, the documented evidence of the legal fight, the careful organization of everything he had gathered over 2 decades in this country. The man had not been hiding a fortune exactly, or not only that. He had been preserving a record, building a room that held both the value and the evidence of how the value had been obtained and what had been done to try to take it away. Joel reached into the nearest oilskin bundle and found, beneath the letter drafts, a smaller folded document he had not noticed until now. He unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map, not like the survey maps, which were technical and notated. This was simpler, a clean-line sketch of the waterfall, the pool, the cliff face, the handhold positions marked with small crosses, and beside each cross a number. A sequence. Instructions for the climb. and at the top of the handholds, a notation, kammeret, the Norwegian word for chamber. Below the map, in Voss's small, precise hand, in English, for whoever finds this before I return, the sum of an honest man's labor. Take it with better luck than I had. Joel folded the map back along its original creases with hands that were not entirely steady. He held it for a moment. He looked around the chamber, the lantern throwing its even light across the shelves and the painted surfaces and the organized evidence of a century of waiting. He thought about Voss in the specific and particular way the room demanded. A man of 53 who had spent 23 years in a foreign country alone, working ground that nobody else valued, building something that nobody else would see. A man who had been methodical and careful and honest by his own standards and had been beaten anyway by people with more money and more legal leverage and no particular scruple about how they used either. He had chosen to disappear rather than surrender what was his. He had written a note for whoever came next, whoever found it before he returned. He had not returned. Joel sat in the chamber for a long time. He was still sitting there when his phone produced the two-note chime of an incoming email. Reception was intermittent through the rock and the waterfall, but it came and went, and he looked at the screen and saw that the message was from Patricia Sunday at the Seattle Art Museum. The subject line read, "Where exactly did you find this?" He opened the email. Patricia had written 4 paragraphs. The first was professional and careful and described her analysis of the 3 photographs he had sent, noting the condition of the canvas and the paint surface, the style of the brushwork visible in the harbor scene, the particular quality of the impasto in the portrait's dark clothing, and the characteristics of the signature's letter forms. The second paragraph noted that the signature appeared consistent with the hand of a Norwegian-born painter who had emigrated to the Pacific Northwest in the late 19th century and who had produced a body of work between approximately 1890 and 1915, several pieces of which were in institutional collections, and 2 of which had been listed as missing since the early 1920s when the artist's estate had been incompletely probated. The third paragraph said, "If the paintings in your photographs are genuine and the photographic evidence is consistent with genuine, then you are looking at works that were last documented in 1922 and have been classified as lost for over a century. Combined value at current market for documented works by this artist runs between $8 and $14 million per piece. I would very much like to understand where you found these." The fourth paragraph was shorter. It addressed the 4th painting, the unsigned abstract piece he had photographed. She had spent time with that image, she wrote, and she wanted to be careful about stating anything definitive from a single photograph taken in difficult lighting conditions. But the compositional approach and the specific handling of the paint surface in the areas where the image was sharp enough to read suggested a period and a school that she would want to discuss in person. If she was reading the photograph correctly, the 4th piece might not be by the same artist as the other 3. It might be considerably more valuable. She had reached out to a colleague who specialized in early modernist work to get a second read before saying anything more specific. "Please call me," the email ended. "Today if possible." Joel read the email. He read it again. He looked up from the phone and let his eyes rest on the 4 paintings hanging on the far wall of the chamber. The portrait, the forest, the harbor, the 4th, the abstract one, different from the others in period and approach. For paintings, 3 by an artist whose documented work sold for $8 to $14 million per piece, and a 4th whose identity he had not yet established. He thought about the 27 containers, the 9 leather pouches in the 3rd container alone, each one holding an uncut stone the size of the one he had lifted in his palm. He thought about the 41 oilskin bundles, most of which he had not yet opened, and what else might be inside them. He thought about the map in Voss's handwriting that indicated a second location he had not yet understood, a notation in the upper corner that read Hoy deposit, a Norwegian phrase he would need Margaret to translate, marked with coordinates that corresponded to a location further up the watershed. He thought about what Hal Briggs had said on the phone. Is this the kind of thing that's going to generate paperwork? He looked around the chamber one more time. He began photographing everything methodically, every shelf, every container, every bundle, every box, working slowly around the perimeter of the room with the camera set on its highest resolution, documenting each item's position and condition before he touched anything. He had been a careful observer for 23 years. The work now required the same thing it had always required: attention, patience, The willingness to look at what was actually there rather than what he expected or hoped to find. An hour later, standing outside on the pool's edge with the falls behind him and his camera full and his notebook pages dense with observations, he called Hal Briggs's direct line. Hal answered on the second ring. "It's more than a historical structure," Joel said. "Significantly more. You'll want to see the photographs before we talk about what comes next." A pause. How significant? Joel thought about the right way to answer. He thought about 27 containers and 41 bundles, and 4 paintings worth $8 to $14 million each, and a map with coordinates pointing further into a watershed that everyone had been treating as empty for the better part of a century. "Significant enough that the conversation is going to change everything," he said. "And I need you to understand something before we have it. I found this. I've been the only person walking this ground for 3 years while everyone else called it the dead zone. Whatever happens next, that matters." The silence on Hal's end lasted long enough to have a specific texture. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual quality of managed impatience. It was careful now, measured, the voice of a man recalculating. "Send me the photographs," Hal said. Joel sent them. He stood at the pool's edge while the files uploaded on the intermittent signal, looking at the falls the way he had looked at them dozens of times before. The same 60-foot drop, the same threads of water catching the light, the same mist drifting out across the surface of the pool, the same firs leaning inward from both walls of the ravine. Everything exactly as it had always been, except now he knew what was behind it. Voss had written, "Take it with better luck than I had." Joel was 51. His savings were thin from 2 years of his mother's medical bills. His job was in the process of ending, and nobody had pretended otherwise except through careful language that amounted to the same thing in the end. His back complained in cold weather, and his knee on stairs, and the school photos of his children on the dashboard of his truck were the most personal objects in his daily life. He was standing at the edge of a pool in a closed trail sector in the Cascade foothills, looking at a waterfall that concealed a room full of 100 years' worth of an honest man's labor, and his phone was uploading photographs of gold bars and uncut diamonds and paintings worth millions to a district director who had just last week been preparing language for a conversation about early retirement. He did not know yet what all of this meant for him specifically, what claims he could make, or what the law said about a ranger who found a century-old chamber on federally managed land and chose to investigate it carefully before reporting. He did not know what the Hoyd deposit notation on Voss's map pointed to, or what Patricia Sunday's full assessment would determine about the 4th painting, or what the 40 oilskin bundles he hadn't yet opened contained. He knew that the upload completed 3 seconds after he had sent the files. He knew that Hal Briggs was looking at the photographs now, in his office on the other side of 40 minutes of highway, and that whatever version of Joel Mercer Hal had been prepared to manage out of a job was being replaced by a different version in real time. He had some sense of what that revision would look like. He had watched Hal's face across a desk for 3 years and understood the man's particular way of reassessing situations once the facts changed. The early retirement language would get folded away into a drawer somewhere and not mentioned again, at least not immediately, at least not until Hal had understood what the photographs represented and made his own calculations. The phone rang 4 minutes after he sent the files. It was Hal. The voice on the other end was not the voice of the meeting 2 months ago, the one with the careful language and the hands spread flat on the desk. This was a different register, quieter, specifically attentive in the way of a man who had just seen something that required him to stop managing and start listening. "These photographs," Hal said. "Yes. The gold bars. Are they documented?" One container opened. 6 bars visible without disturbing the straw. Maker's marks, weight notations. I photographed them at close range. The quality of the marks is consistent with private foundry work from the early part of the 20th century. Hal was quiet for several seconds. "And the paintings? I've been in contact with a conservator at the Seattle Art Museum. She responded this afternoon. Her preliminary read on the photographs suggests that 3 of the 4 are consistent with documented works by a specific artist Norwegian-born, active in this region between 1890 and 1915. The artist's work sells an institutional auction at $8 to $14 million per piece. 2 of those documented works have been classified as lost since 1922. Another silence. Longer. "Joel." Hal's voice had a quality now that Joel had never heard in it before. Not warmth exactly. Something more cautious than warmth, more deliberate. The quality of a person who has understood that the ground beneath a conversation has shifted and is choosing their next words with unusual care. How long have you known about this? I found the entrance 4 days ago. I've been documenting and researching before filing to make sure I understood what I was looking at. That's outside protocol. I know. We'll need to discuss that. A pause that contained the acknowledgement that the discussion would not be the same one it would have been a week ago. In the meantime, I'm going to make some calls. Federal Land Management is going to need to be looped in. The State Historical Office. Possibly the U.S. Marshals, depending on how the legal situation shakes out regarding the contents. Another pause. You should know that once this gets to a certain level, the question of who has jurisdiction over the site and its contents is going to get complicated. I expect it will, Joel said. There's also the question of your role going forward, given that you found it. Hal said this carefully, neither offering nor withholding. Leaving space. That's a question I intend to be part of answering, Joel said. This sector has been called the dead zone by the people in this district for 3 years. I've been the only person walking it. I've been the only person who knew it well enough to see what the light was doing to that cliff face at the right time of year. He looked at the waterfall above him, the 60 feet of falling water that had been doing this since before anyone who worked in his district had been born. I found this. That matters in whatever comes next. Hal was quiet for a moment. I'm not arguing with that, he said finally. Good. Joel hung up and stood at the pool's edge for a while longer without moving. He thought about Voss, a man of 53 who had written 3 words in his ledger and walked away from a life built over 2 decades, rather than surrender what was his to people who had not earned it and did not deserve it. He had built a room to hold the evidence and the value together, in a place so well chosen that a century of searching, of seasonal survey, of logging operations and trail construction and federal land management had never found it. He had written a note for whoever came next, whoever found it before he returned. He had put his faith in the mountain. Joel was standing in front of that faith, looking at the water it had kept. He thought about what it meant that he had been the one to find it. Not a mining company, not a development survey, not someone with a metal detector and a recreational permit. A ranger who had been spending his salary on his mother's medical bills and driving a truck with ruin shocks to a posting that everyone around him had already decided was pointless, walking a piece of ground that nobody valued, in the particular way that a person walks ground they have come to understand as their own. The falls ran above him, unchanged. 60 feet of cold water over old basalt, the same as it had been yesterday and the day before and every day of the 103 years since Henrik Voss had set the iron bar in its brackets and gone back down the handholds for the last time. Voss had written, "Take it with better luck than I had." Joel folded the note back into the waterproof case and put it in his pack and started up the trail for the last time that day, with the photographs sent and the calls made and the process now in motion, and the particular steadiness of a man who has spent 23 years learning to read terrain and has just read the most consequential piece of terrain of his life correctly. He had found it. Whatever came next, that was true and it was his, and nobody's careful language would change it. The process moved faster than Joel had expected, and in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. By the morning after his call with Hal Briggs, he had 3 messages on his phone from numbers he didn't recognize. 2 were from the district office. One was from a federal land management coordinator in Seattle whose name he hadn't encountered before. Hal had moved quickly, which meant that whatever calculation Hal had performed after looking at the photographs had produced a result urgent enough to override his ordinary pace. Joel had expected the process to take weeks to mobilize. It took less than 48 hours. He called Patricia Sunday first. She answered before the second ring. Her voice had the quality of a person who had been waiting for the call and had prepared for it. She confirmed what her email had said about the 3 signed paintings and added that her colleague, a specialist in early European modernism named Dr. Lena Hartwig, based at a university in Vancouver, had looked at the photograph of the 4th piece and had asked Patricia, with some urgency, whether it was possible to arrange an in-person visit to the site within the week. How urgent, Joel said. She used the word significant 3 times in a single text message, Patricia said. For Lena, that's roughly equivalent to screaming. Joel asked what she thought the 4th painting was. I don't want to say before Lena sees it in person, Patricia said. But I'll tell you this: when I described the dimensions and the compositional approach to her and mentioned the approximate period, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "That's impossible." Then she said, "I need to see it." Joel said he would arrange the visit. He said nothing about the federal teams that would be arriving that same week. He understood, without it being stated, that the window in which he could manage the process with any degree of autonomy was narrowing. Once the federal machinery was fully engaged, the site would belong to the process. He needed Patricia and Dr. Hartvig there before that happened. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He called Hal's direct line and told him that an art conservator from the Seattle Art Museum and a specialist from the University of British Columbia needed access to the site before any federal team disturbed the chamber's interior. He said this with the careful specificity of a man who understood that he was making a claim rather than a request, and that the distinction mattered. Hal paused before answering. The pause was the same length as the one on the previous call, the one that had indicated recalibration. How quickly can they get there? Thursday, Joel said. If I arrange it today, I can hold the federal team until Friday, Hal said. That's the limit of what I can do. It was enough. Patricia and Dr. Lena Hartvig drove up together on Thursday morning, arriving at the trailhead before 8. Patricia was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in her movements, wearing field clothes that were practical without being careless. Dr. Hartvig was older, in her late 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular stillness of a person who had spent decades in the focused company of paintings and had come to require the same quality of attention from the world around her. They didn't speak much on the trail. Joel set a pace that was firm without being aggressive, and they matched it. He had warned them about the climb on the handholds. Both women had brought gloves and soft-soled footwear, and they had both clearly assessed the route from his description with the practical imagination of people who were used to getting to things that weren't easy to get to. Dr. Hartvig stood at the base of the cliff for a moment before climbing, looking up at the falls with an expression that Joel couldn't read. Then she put her hands on the first hold and began to ascend. Inside the tunnel, Joel led with the lantern. The same resonance from the falls through the rock. The same smell. The same cold, stable air that had been doing its work for over a century. He felt the familiarity of the place settle over him the way familiar places did, with a specific comfort that had its own character. He opened the door. Dr. Hartvig walked into the chamber and stopped within 3 steps. She stood there for a long time, not examining anything, just looking at the room as a whole, the 3 walls of organized shelving, the containers and bundles and boxes, and the 4 paintings on the far wall catching the lantern light from across the chamber. She looked at the paintings from that distance first, without moving closer. Then she crossed the room. She stood before the 4th painting, the unsigned abstract piece, the one that differed from the others in period and approach, and she did not look at it the way Joel had looked at things he recognized. She looked at it the way Patricia had described her, going quiet on the phone, with a stillness that was too complete for ordinary observation. Something in her had stopped moving. Patricia stood beside Joel at the chamber entrance. She looked at Dr. Hartvig, then at Joel, and said nothing. After 2 minutes that had the texture of much longer, Dr. Hartvig turned around. Her expression was composed and her voice was steady when she spoke, but something around her eyes was not entirely steady. "I need to make a call," she said. "Before I say anything about this painting, I need to call someone in Oslo." She stepped back through the door and into the tunnel, holding her phone up to find a signal, moving toward the entrance. Joel heard the waterfall surge back into audibility as she approached the tunnel's mouth. Patricia looked at the 4th painting from across the room. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Joel. "I want to be careful," she said, "but I think you should prepare yourself for the possibility that the 4th piece changes the scale of what this discovery represents." "How much?" Joel said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Significantly," she said, and the word landed with a weight that its ordinary usage had never previously given it. They waited in the tunnel entrance while Dr. Hartvig made her call, the falls loud beside them, the cold mist touching their faces. Joel could hear fragments of the conversation, Norwegian and English alternating, the kind of technical shorthand that passed between specialists who had been working the same field for decades. He couldn't follow the content, but he could follow the tone, The increasing intensity in Dr. Hartvig's voice as the call progressed, the specific quality that entered it when she appeared to receive a confirmation she had been waiting for. She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand, and the falls roaring beside her for a moment. Then she turned to face them. "The painting," she said, "is not by the same artist as the other three. It was produced approximately 15 years later, during a period when the artist was living in Norway before emigrating. There are two other pieces from this specific period in existence. Both of them are in National Museum collections. The last time a third piece from this period came to market, which was 41 years ago, it sold for what was then the highest price ever achieved at auction for a Scandinavian work." She paused. "At current market, based on what the last comparable piece fetched 6 years ago, a third piece from this period would be valued at a minimum of $65 million, possibly significantly more, given the rarity." The falls were very loud. "Voss owned it," Joel said. "It was not a question. Whoever built this room owned it," Dr. Hartvig said. "The question of how they came to own it is a question for historians and lawyers. The question of what it is that I can answer." She looked at him with the calm of a person who had spent her professional life in the vicinity of extraordinary things and had learned that the appropriate response to them was precision rather than emotion. "You found something that has not been seen since before I was born," she said. "That doesn't happen. And then it happens once. And it happened here." By the following week, the federal teams were in. For people from the Land Management Office, a documentation specialist from the State Historical Society, 2 conservation officers, and a federal agent whose precise function was described to Joel in language that circled around the word oversight without ever landing on anything more specific. They set up a staging area at the trailhead. They rigged a cable assist for the cliff climb to replace the handhold route. They worked methodically, photographing and cataloging every item in the chamber before anything was moved, which took the better part of 3 days. Joel was present for all of it, not as a lead. The federal process had its own hierarchy, and he was not at its top. But he was there. He had insisted on that in the conversation with Hal, and Hal had not pushed back. The documentation work was exacting and thorough. Joel watched the federal team's conservation specialist handle Voss's oilskin bundles with gloved hands and proper archival tools, removing each one from its shelf with a care that would have satisfied Voss himself, and found the watching easier than he had expected. These people were competent. They understood what they were handling. The materials deserved this kind of attention and were receiving it. What Joel was less comfortable with was the way the discovery was beginning to be discussed in the language that federal processes used for these things, as a recovery, as a site, as material of historical significance. Language that was accurate and entirely removed from any human dimension. Henrik Voss did not appear in the federal team's working documents as a person. He appeared as an original depositor, a designation that was technically precise and had nothing of the man's actual character in it. Nothing of the 23 years in foreign country, alone, reading ground that most people had dismissed. Nothing of September 12, 1921, and 3 words in Norwegian, and a man who had chosen disappearance over surrender. On the second day of the federal team's work, one of the conservation officers asked Joel about the handholds. Were they documented? Were they going to be assessed as a structural feature of the site? Joel said they were documented in his original field report and that he had recommended their inclusion in any historical designation of the site. The officer nodded and made a notation. Joel went back to his truck that evening and called Margaret Cole. He described the conversation. She listened without interrupting, in the way she listened to everything. "They're not wrong to treat it the way they're treating it," she said, when he had finished. "But you're not wrong to feel what you're feeling about it either. The two things can both be true." He said he understood that. He said he was having trouble keeping the two things separate in the moment. "That's because you know something they don't," Margaret said. "You know what the room cost to build. They know what the room contains. Those are different kinds of knowing, and they don't translate easily to each other." He sat with that for a long time after he hung up. Hal called him on the 4th day of the federal team's work. His voice had settled into something Joel hadn't heard from him before, a specific kind of respect that wasn't comfortable for either of them, because it hadn't been present before and its arrival acknowledged what had been absent. "The preliminary inventory is coming in," Hal said. "The total is going to be substantial. The conservators are still working on the paintings, but the gold alone is going to be a significant number." A pause. I want you to know that I've told the regional director that the discovery was entirely your work, that you identified the site, documented it properly, and brought it forward in good faith. I wanted to make sure that was on record. Joel held the phone and thought about how to respond. He thought about the meeting 2 months ago, the hands flat on the desk, the careful language about changed significantly. He thought about Doug and the dead zone. He thought about 3 years of driving 12 miles of logging road to a job that the people responsible for it had decided wasn't necessary. I appreciate that, he said. He kept his voice level, because what he appreciated was not the same as what he felt, and the distinction was worth maintaining. The restructuring, Hal said. He stopped. He started again. The restructuring review for your sector is on hold indefinitely. Given the discovery, the region has an interest in maintaining a consistent presence in the Coldwater Creek area. We'll be talking about what that looks like going forward. We will, Joel agreed. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. He did not feel the triumph that the moment might have been expected to produce. He felt something quieter, more specific than triumph. The particular satisfaction of a fact being acknowledged that had been true all along. The town had heard about the discovery by the end of that first week. Joel had not told anyone beyond the people directly involved, but the federal vehicles at the trailhead were visible from the county road, and the staging equipment was not subtle, and in a county of this size, unusual activity at a remote trailhead produced questions that produced answers that traveled. By Friday, the local paper had a brief story on its website. By the following Monday, the regional news had picked it up. By Wednesday, it had gone national. Doug found Joel at the ranger station on Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the federal team had arrived. He was visibly energized in the way of a person who has been telling a story for several days and has refined it through repetition into something better than the original experience. Hell of a thing, Doug said. I've been telling people. I said to my wife, I always knew there was something up in that sector. Joel never talked about it much, but you could see it. Guy walks that country every day for 3 years. He knows things. He clapped Joel on the shoulder with the specific enthusiasm of a man borrowing adjacent glory. You're going to be famous. Joel looked at him. You called it the dead zone, he said. Not harshly. Simply. Doug had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable for a moment. Then he laughed, the way people laughed when they wanted to move past something without addressing it. Dead zone. Sure. Well. He shrugged. I guess not. He was going to want to tell this story for years. Joel understood that. He understood that the story Doug told would eventually have dug in it more centrally than the facts warranted, and that this was simply what happened. He didn't particularly mind. Doug was not a bad person. He was an ordinary one, which was its own kind of thing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The lawyer's name was Ellen Marsh, recommended by Margaret Cole of all people, who had called Joel 2 weeks into the federal process and said she had been thinking about his situation and had a name to offer if he wanted it. Ellen Marsh was based in Olympia and had spent the previous 20 years handling a specific category of cases involving federal land, historical recovery, and finders' rights. She was 58, direct, and had the quality of a person who had been in enough rooms with federal attorneys to understand precisely how the arguments would be arranged and where the pressure points were. She filed a formal finder's claim on Joel's behalf within a week of their first meeting. The claim cited provisions in federal recovery statute, historical precedent in comparable cases, and the specific circumstances of the discovery. Joel's exclusive stewardship of the sector for 3 years, the demonstrably undocumented character of the site prior to his find, and his good faith documentation and reporting process. The federal attorneys responded, as Ellen had predicted they would, with the argument that contents found on federally managed land defaulted to federal custody. Ellen countered with the established case law on finders' rights for discoveries of non-federal historical materials on federal land, and with the specific circumstance that the chamber had been built and stocked by a private individual on land he owned before federal acquisition, and that no public record had documented its existence before Joel found it. The federal side then argued that Joel's delay in reporting, the 4 days between finding the chamber and informing Hal Briggs, constituted a breach of his duties as a ranger, and that this breach should disqualify his finder's claim. Ellen produced Joel's field notebook with its date stamps, his original report to Hal describing a historical structure requiring documentation, and the email to Patricia Sunday sent while he was still in the preliminary assessment phase. She argued that a ranger conducting due diligence before filing a report on an unprecedented discovery was the definition of professional conduct, not a breach of it. Joel sat through the first federal hearing in a conference room in Seattle and listened to his professional record of 23 years being examined for anything that could be used against the claim. The federal attorneys were not hostile in a personal sense. They were simply doing the work of arguing their side, which happened to include building the case that Joel's value to the discovery was procedural rather than substantive, that anyone walking that trail on that afternoon would have seen what he saw, that the discovery was a function of position rather than expertise. Ellen let them finish their argument. Then she asked Joel to describe, in precise technical terms, what the late September light at that specific time of afternoon at that specific latitude did to the surface of the cliff face, and why that phenomenon was only visible for approximately 40 minutes on perhaps 8 to 12 afternoons per year, and how a person unfamiliar with the sector's terrain and seasonal light patterns would not have recognized what they were seeing even if they had been standing in the same spot. Joel answered for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He described the physics of low-angle raking light on a worked stone surface, the conditions under which shallow cuts became visible that were otherwise invisible, the length of the window per season during which those conditions existed, and the specific combination of his knowledge of the terrain and his attention to it that had produced the observation. The federal attorney who had been arguing the position rather than expertise line did not pursue the point further. The process moved into negotiation in November, after the preliminary hearings were complete. Ellen described negotiation as the part where both sides acknowledge that going to a full trial costs more than settling, and they discuss what settlement looks like. It was not romantic. It was not the vindication scene that people imagined when they thought about these things. It was two sets of attorneys in a conference room calculating percentages and precedents, and what a judge might award if the matter went to trial, and each side lost its respective arguments partially. What Joel wanted, beyond the financial settlement, was specific, the formal finder's designation, his name alongside Voss's in the historical record, and the interpretive sign at the Waterfall pool that said Henrik Voss rather than unknown minor. Ellen asked for all of it. The federal side agreed to the last two without difficulty. The first required more negotiation. By December they had a number. Joel hiked to the waterfall on a December morning when the federal team had finished their work and the site was temporarily quiet. The cable assist had been left in place. He climbed it without using it. The same handholds Voss had cut, the same wet stone and cold mist, his hands and the basalt in the same relationship they had been since the first time. The chamber was empty. Everything had been moved to a conservation facility in Seattle. The shelves were bare. The iron hooks on the far wall still held nothing. The lantern light he carried found only the worked stone walls and the ceiling arch and the floor. The room itself, stripped of its contents, still exactly the shape that one man had cut from rock over the course of months or years in the early 20th century. Joel stood in the center and held the lantern and looked at the room. He had not expected to find this difficult. The contents were where they should be, handled by people who understood what they were handling, in conditions that would serve the materials better than a sealed chamber could serve them indefinitely. The process had been done right. The removal had been careful and documented and carried out with the specific competence the materials deserved. But the room without its contents was a different kind of place. Not diminished. The scale of it was unchanged. The shaped ceiling still arched at the same height. The worked stone walls still carried the evidence of the same sustained labor that had produced them. The shelves were still there. The door still hung on its heavy hinges. The iron bar was still in its brackets. What was different was that the room now meant only what it had always been, without the distraction of what it contained. The gold and the paintings and the oilskin bundles had been extraordinary enough to temporarily overwhelm the simpler, more permanent fact. A man had stood here in the dark with a candle and a chisel and built something meant to last without him. Had built it knowing it needed to outlast the threat that was closing in from the watershed below. Had built it for someone whose name and character he couldn't know, addressing his note to no specific person because there was no specific person to address. Just whoever came next. whoever found it before he returned. Joel stood in the empty room and understood more clearly than he had before what kind of thing it was. Not a vault, not a hiding place. A letter, cut in stone rather than paper, addressed to no one, kept by the mountain for a century until the right person walked in with a lantern. The contents had been the message. The room was the hand that wrote it. He stood there a while longer before climbing back down. The Hoyd deposit notation on Voss's map had been translated by Margaret as upper-level deposit or elevated cache, and the coordinates had indicated a location approximately a mile above the waterfall, further into the watershed than Joel had routinely patrolled. In November, with the federal team's documentation work complete and the legal process underway, he had taken 3 days to hike the upper watershed with the map and his own knowledge of the terrain. He found what the notation pointed to on the second day. Not a chamber this time. A natural fissure in the basalt that Voss had widened slightly and sealed with a timber and stone plug that had settled and degraded enough over a century to look, from a distance, like ordinary rockfall debris. Inside the fissure, wrapped in oilskin that had dried and cracked but still held its original structure, were survey rolls. Detailed maps of the gold seam Voss had been working, drawn with the precision he had demonstrated in everything else. Extent, depth, estimated volume. Notes on extraction methodology. The kind of documentation that a geologist or mining engineer would produce when trying to understand a significant find comprehensively. The seam, according to Voss's notes, ran for approximately 400 meters along a specific geological contact zone in the upper watershed. The estimated volume he had recorded in 1918, before the Pacific Consolidated Pressure had begun in earnest, represented a quantity that at current gold prices amounted to a figure Joel could calculate only approximately, because he was a ranger and not a mining engineer, and the calculation required assumptions he couldn't make with confidence. He could make it roughly, though. Very roughly. The number was large, much larger than what had been in the chamber. He photographed everything in the fissure, documented the location with GPS, and filed an addendum to his original report the following morning. Ellen Marsh added the new documentation to the ongoing legal proceedings with the focused efficiency of a person who had just been handed a significant additional argument. The full appraisal of the chamber's contents came back in late February, 7 months after the September afternoon when the light had come in at the right angle. Joel was at his kitchen table when Ellen called him with the numbers. He had made coffee. The school photos were on the counter where he had moved them when the dash had gotten cluttered with the field notebooks and photocopies that had accumulated over the previous months. Cassie at 10. Marcus at 8. He had been looking at those photographs from various angles for 3 years and had never thought of them as anything other than a habit, a small ceremony of fatherhood performed daily in a truck cab. Looking at them now, he was aware that the distance between himself and the people those children had grown into was not a permanent condition and had not been required by any external force. It had accumulated from choices he had made and could make differently. Ellen read the figures in the clear, unhurried manner she used for all significant information, giving each line time to register before moving to the next. The gold bars across all 27 containers, $43 million at current spot price. The gemstones, which had turned out to include not just diamonds, but a significant quantity of Colombian emeralds that Voss had apparently acquired through trading relationships with other independent prospectors over 2 decades, $31 million. The 3 signed paintings, authenticated and valued by Patricia Sunday's team in collaboration with Dr. Hartwig's institution, $38 million combined. The 4th painting, the unsigned abstract, the one that had made Dr. Hartwig stand still in the middle of the chamber and asked to make a phone call, $67 million, based on the comparable sale 6 years prior and adjusted upward for rarity, given that no other piece from this specific period had been known to exist outside institutional collections. Historical documents and survey materials, $11 million, primarily for the Voss ledger and the survey rolls from the fissure, which had attracted significant interest from Norwegian cultural heritage organizations. Other items in the smaller boxes, which had turned out to include antique scientific instruments, a collection of hand-carved Norwegian folk objects of considerable age, and several categories of material that the appraisers had needed specialists to evaluate, $8 million. Total appraised value of the Coldwater Creek discovery, $198 million. Joel sat with that number. He set down the coffee cup because his hand was not quite steady enough to trust it. He was 51 years old. He had been driving 12 miles of logging road every morning for 3 years to a job that the people responsible for it had decided was unnecessary. He had been eating granola bars at the wheel of a truck with ruined shocks and sending Christmas cards signed with his name in full because the word dad alone didn't feel like sufficient identification. He had been carrying his mother's medical debt in a repayment plan that stretched 3 more years into the future. He had been watching his career be reorganized into irrelevance and had not been wrong to feel, in the most honest part of himself, that the work was worth more than the system that contained it could measure. The finder's claim settlement, Ellen said. She had been building to this. He could hear it in the careful pace of her delivery. The federal negotiation concluded this morning. Given the complexity of the case and the multiple categories of material involved, the settlement is structured as a percentage of appraised value across categories, not a flat rate. The weighted average comes to 19%. A pause. After taxes and legal fees, your net is approximately $31 million. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee was getting cold. He thought about his mother's last year and what her medical bills had cost, and the specific quality of that debt, which had not been financial exactly, but something more personal. The feeling of having fallen short of something she deserved, of having carried her last year in a way that was sufficient but not generous, because sufficient was all the margin had allowed. Joel, Ellen said. Are you there? I'm here, he said. You should also know, she continued, that the Norwegian government has made a separate cultural heritage claim regarding the Voss materials, the ledger, the survey maps, the folk objects. They have requested that a portion of those materials be repatriated to Norway. Given the diplomatic context, the federal government is inclined to agree. However, they have also proposed that the discovery be formally recognized in your name in the Norwegian cultural record, which means that Henrik Voss's chamber and everything in it will be documented in the historical record as the Mercer-Voss discovery. Your name, alongside his. Joel looked at the school photos on the counter. He thought about calling them that afternoon. Not on a birthday, just to talk. That seems right, he said quietly. Both names. He paid off the remainder of his mother's medical debt that week. The last of it, the portion that had been sitting in a repayment plan that stretched 3 more years into the future. The payment was processed in 12 minutes on a bank website, and when the confirmation came through, there was nothing ceremonial about it, just a number changing to 0 on a screen. But he sat with it for a long time after the screen went dark. He bought the small house he had been renting, paying outright. 3 bedrooms and a yard, and the fir tree line visible from the kitchen window. He got it inspected, found the things that needed fixing, had them fixed properly rather than deferred the way he had been deferring them for 3 years as a renter. The house settled into being his in the particular way that places settled when they knew you were staying. He called Cassie on a Tuesday, not a birthday, not a holiday, not because anything specific required a call. She answered after 2 rings, her voice carrying the slight uncertainty of a person who didn't know why her father was calling outside the ordinary occasions. Nothing's wrong, he said immediately, because he understood that this was what she would think. Okay, she said. A pause. Are you all right? Better than I've been in a while, he said. I wanted to talk to you. That's the whole reason. I wanted to know how things are going. What followed was an hour-long conversation that was ordinary in its content. Tyler's new job, a hiking trip she had taken in August, a show she had been watching that she thought Joel might like despite himself, and extraordinary in its texture, because it was the first call in years that neither of them had been trying to make seem like enough. It just was what it was. 2 people who had been on opposite sides of a distance they had both contributed to, talking on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason other than that they wanted to. He called Marcus the following week. Shorter conversation, the way Marcus's conversations tended to be, but warmer. Marcus had followed the news coverage of the discovery with the kind of attentive interest he rarely expressed directly. He said, at the end of the call, that he had always known there was more going on up in that sector than anyone gave credit for. Joel recognized Doug's phrasing in the sentiment and felt an uncomplicated affection for his son for having arrived at the same place through different means. In March, he established the Henrik Voss Wilderness Preservation Fund. Before he did, he learned what had happened to Henrik Voss. The Norwegian cultural heritage inquiry that had accompanied the repatriation process had involved a genealogical researcher in Oslo named Bjorn Haugen, who had spent 6 weeks tracing Voss's history both in Norway and in Washington state through records on both sides of the Atlantic. He had sent his findings to Joel directly, with a covering note that was careful and formal in the way that official correspondence from one country to a private citizen in another tended to be. Voss had been born in 1868 in a small coastal town in western Norway, the son of a mining engineer and a schoolteacher. He had trained at the Bergen Technical College, emigrated in 1898 following the death of his parents, and arrived in Washington state with qualifications and a reputation for geological precision that had preceded him through the Norwegian immigrant community. He had worked his first claims legally and reported his yields accurately until sometime around 1910, when Haugen believed the scale of the gold seam's potential had become clear enough that continued honest reporting posed a specific danger. Pacific Consolidated Mining, Haugen had found, was not simply a mining company. It was a subsidiary of a larger industrial holding that had been systematically acquiring high-yield claims in the Pacific Northwest through a combination of legal pressure and what Haugen described, with diplomatic understatement, as methods that fell short of the legal standard. 2 other independent prospectors in the same watershed had lost their claims to the company between 1912 and 1917, both through legal proceedings that later analysis suggested had relied on falsified survey materials. Voss had known this. His letters made clear he had known it, which was why he had spent 1919 and 1920 fighting with meticulous documentation rather than simply walking away. In September 1921, Haugen had found a notation in a Pacific Consolidated Company ledger, which had been digitized by the Washington State Archives as part of a broader historical business records project. The notation was brief. It recorded that a matter concerning the Coldwater Creek claim had been resolved, and that the company's survey team could proceed to the upper watershed. The date was September 14, 1921, 2 days after Voss's final ledger entry. Haugen had not been able to determine what resolved meant in that context. No death record for Voss existed in any archive he had searched. No record of departure from the United States. No record of return to Norway. No record of any kind, anywhere, after September 12, 1921. Joel read Haugen's report 3 times. He sat with the word resolve for a long time. He wrote back to Haugen and thanked him. He said the information was important and that it would be included in the historical record of the Mercer-Voss discovery in whatever way was most appropriate. He said that whatever had happened to Henrik Voss in September 1921, the room he had built had outlasted the company that had tried to take what was in it. Pacific Consolidated Mining had dissolved in 1938 after a series of financial failures. Henrik Voss's chamber had been sealed and intact on the day it dissolved, and had remained so for another 83 years after that. He did not know if that was justice. He thought it was something, even if it wasn't that. It was a straightforward instrument, a charitable trust directing funds to wilderness conservation efforts in the Cascade Range, with a specific priority on protecting undeveloped high country terrain from commercial acquisition. He put $10 million into it at founding. Margaret Cole agreed to serve on its advisory board. Dr. Hartvig wrote a letter of endorsement from Vancouver that was read at the small founding ceremony Joel held in the county seat on a Thursday afternoon with 12 people in attendance. He had thought about what to name it for a long time before settling on the simplest version. Not the Mercer-Voss Fund. Not the Coldwater Creek Discovery Fund. Just the Henrik Voss Wilderness Preservation Fund, because Voss was the one who had done the real work, who had spent 23 years in foreign country alone, reading the ground, understanding the rock, keeping what he found from the people who would have stripped it without care. Voss had chosen the mountain. The mountain had kept its promise. This was the appropriate acknowledgement. The Federal Land Management Office formally redesignated the Coldwater Creek sector as a protected historical and ecological zone in April. The trail to the waterfall was reopened, with the lower section cleared and rerouted to avoid the rockfall zone that had closed it 11 years ago. The handholds on the cliff face were declared a protected historical feature and marked with a small interpretive sign at the pool's edge, the kind that provided context without diminishing the scale of what it described. Joel read the sign's draft copy when they sent it to him for review and suggested one change. The original draft had described the handholds as cut by an unknown miner in the early 20th century. He asked them to change unknown to Henrik Voss. They did. On a Saturday in late April, the first weekend the reopened trail was accessible, Joel walked to the waterfall alone. Not as a ranger on patrol. As a person walking to a place he knew and valued, for reasons that were entirely his own. The spring light was strong and direct, nothing like the late September angle that had started everything, but good light in its own way. The kind that came with new growth leaves and snow running off the upper elevations, and the creek running full and clear over the basalt. The falls were loud with spring volume. The pool churned in green, the mist heavy and cold on his face as he came down the final slope. He stood at the pool's edge for a long time. Other people had come that day. 3 of them stopped at the new interpretive sign, reading it. 2 were in their 30s with proper trail gear, the kind of people who had looked at the reopened trail notice and decided 6 miles was worth it. The third was older, writing something in a small notebook. He watched them without approaching. They moved on eventually, up to the base of the cliff, looking at the handholds with the particular attentiveness of people in the presence of something that had suddenly acquired meaning beyond its surface. He understood that. He had stood where they were standing, in September, in different light, and looked at the same cuts for the first time. He had known what he was looking at as a technical matter and not known what he was looking at as anything else. The knowing had come in layers, through Margaret's files and Voss's ledger, and the chamber empty and full and the long months of process that had followed. The handholds were visible from where he stood. 19 cuts in the basalt, the edges worn smooth by a century of mist, each one the product of a man working alone in a place nobody was watching, doing work that the world would not notice for 100 years. The interpretive sign at the pool's edge described them in 4 sentences. The 4 sentences were accurate and insufficient, the way 4 sentences about anything that mattered tended to be. He thought about Voss climbing those holds in the other direction, from the top down, checking the chamber a final time, descending for the last time in September 1921, setting his feet carefully on the basalt, dropping to the pool's edge, and standing where Joel was standing now. Had he looked back up at the falls? Joel didn't know. He thought he might have. A man who built with that care, who documented with that precision, who wrote a note in the particular English of someone for whom it was a second language. That was a man who understood the weight of final things, who understood that some gestures were for the person who came next, not for the person making them. He thought about what it meant that he had been the one to find it. He had thought about this many times in the months since, and each time the thinking arrived at the same place. It was not accidental, but it was not inevitable either. He had been here because he had chosen a kind of work that most people found insufficient, and he had done that work with a quality of attention that most people found excessive. And on a September afternoon, when the light came in at the right angle, the attention had seen what the light revealed. That was the whole mechanism. Nothing mystical. Just a person doing careful work in a place they had stayed long enough to understand. Voss had done the same thing from the other direction. A man in a different century doing careful work in the same place, staying long enough to understand it differently than anyone around him had. 2 men, 100 years apart, paying the kind of attention to the same mountain that the mountain apparently required before it gave anything back. Joel set his pack down on the broad flat rock on the east side of the pool, the one he had been sitting on for 3 years before any of this happened. He sat on it. The falls ran above him. The mist came out across the water in its slow patterns. The firs leaned inward from both sides of the ravine in the particular way they always did, the sound filling every direction. He thought about Voss's note. Take it with better luck than I had. He thought about what he had done with it. $31 million, yes, but also the fund in Voss's name, and the legal record that would carry both their names forward, and the reopened trail, and the interpretive sign that said Henrik Voss where it had originally said unknown, and the phone call to Cassie on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason other than wanting to talk. He thought about the specific quality of luck that Voss had asked for, and whether what had happened constituted it. He thought luck was probably not the right word for what he had received, or not the whole word. He had received something that was partly luck and partly the accumulated return on 23 years of paying attention to a piece of ground that nobody else valued. On a morning when the light was doing something it only did in late September, at the angle it only reached in the last hour before the western ridge took the sun. Voss had chosen the mountain. Joel had walked the mountain. The mountain had done the rest. He sat on the rock until the afternoon light started to change, until the shadow of the western ridge began to advance across the pool from the right side, and the green of the water deepened and the mist shifted in its patterns. He sat until the quality of the light approaching the cliff face began to move toward the horizontal angle of late afternoon, the same angle that had done this in the first place. He watched the cuts in the basalt come visible in the low light, 19 of them, regular and deliberate, the work of a man who had understood what he was building and why. He picked up his pack. He walked back up the trail in the long spring evening, past the cedar log he had cleared 18 months ago, and which was now half buried in new growth, past the second switchback and the drainage that ran fast with snow melt, past the places where he had stopped 100 times to note a change in the vegetation or the sound of the water or the pattern of animal prints in soft ground. All of it familiar, all of it his, in the way that places were yours when you had walked them in every season with the quality of attention they required. He thought, on the trail, about the conversation he'd had with Cassie the previous week. She had asked him what it had been like, finding the chamber. Not the formal version he'd told in interviews and hearings, but the actual experience, standing there in the dark with the lantern, looking at what was in the room for the first time. He had tried to describe it honestly, which meant acknowledging that the first thing he had felt was not excitement or disbelief. It was recognition, the sense that he was standing in a place that had been waiting to be found by someone who would understand what it cost to build it. He didn't know if he had been the right person for that. He thought he might have been close enough. Cassie had been quiet for a moment after he said that. Then she said, "I think that's the most you've ever told me about how something felt." He had sat with that for several days. He thought she was right. He thought the distance between them had been built partly from that, his habit of reporting what he observed rather than what he experienced, the same quality that made him good at the work and less present in the rooms where the work didn't apply. The discovery had not cured that habit exactly, but it had given him a specific example of why the habit was insufficient. A man who only reported what he observed and never said what he felt left no record of himself that was worth keeping. Voss had understood this. His note for whoever came next was not a survey. It was a person speaking. The truck was at the trailhead. 11 years old, the shock still bad, the school photos still on the dash. He had thought about replacing it. He had the money now, more than enough. He had thought about it and decided against it, at least for now. The truck had been here through all of it, the logging road, and the early mornings, and the 3 years of walking a sector that everyone else called the dead zone. He wasn't finished with it yet. He drove the 12 miles of logging road in the last of the evening light, the trees close on both sides, and the road familiar in every pothole and soft shoulder. He thought about what he was driving toward, the small house that was his now, with the fir tree line from the kitchen window, and the phone he would use to call Cassie again on Thursday, not because anything required a call, but because he was done treating the distance between them as a condition rather than a choice. He thought about everything the mountain had held and given back, and what he had tried to do with it. The fund in Voss's name. The trail reopened. The sign that said Henrik Voss where it had originally said unknown. The debt to his mother cleared. The house bought outright. The children called on ordinary days. The record that would carry both their names, his and Voss's, in the historical account of this piece of land and what had been found in it. He thought about what it had cost Henrik Voss to build what he had built, and to lose what he had lost, and to write his note in a second language to no one specific, trusting the stone to hold until the right person came. He thought about the word resolved in a company ledger dated September 14, 1921, and what it had meant for a man who had spent 23 years building something honest in a country that ultimately couldn't protect it from people who operated without scruple. He thought about the difference between a life that was measured by what it produced and a life that was measured by how it was lived. Voss had produced something extraordinary and had been destroyed for it, and had never collected what was his. Joel had walked in the wake of that, and had collected what Voss had intended for whoever came, and had tried to use it in a way that honored the fact that the trust had been kept. He didn't know if he had done enough. He thought he had done what was honest, and that was the most a person could reliably aim for. The road curved. The last light dropped behind the ridge. The headlights came on automatically, cutting through the new dark between the trees. Joel drove home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.